Hey guys, tonight we begin one of the most scandalous tales in Roman history. Picture this. A teenage girl, barely 17, walks into the most powerful palace on earth. Within 7 years, she'll be dead, executed for crimes so shocking that Rome tried to erase her very existence from history. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. What if the woman they called Rome's most depraved empress was actually playing a different game entirely? What if those brothel stories, those tales of her bedding 25 men in a single night, what if they were all written by her enemies 70 years after she died? Tonight we're going to meet the real Valeria Messalina, and trust me, her true story is far more terrifying than any scandal. So before we unravel this ancient mystery together, if you're intrigued by what you're about to hear, why not join our little community here? Hit that subscribe button if you love these late-night historical journeys, and maybe drop a like if this story captures your imagination. I'm curious, are you tucked in bed right now, or maybe listening while doing something else? Let me know in the comments where in the world you're joining me from tonight. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back 2,000 years to ancient Rome. The year is 38 CE. Rome is, well, let's just say it's seen better days. The mad Emperor Caligula is on the throne, and when I say mad, I mean the kind of mad where you make your horse a senator and declare war on the ocean. Yeah, that actually happened. The entire empire is walking on eggshells, never knowing if today's the day the emperor decides you're plotting against him, which usually means you're dead by sunset. In this atmosphere of absolute terror, a young girl named Valeria Messalina is about to make the most calculated move of her life. She's 17, maybe 18 at most. Now, before you picture some naive teenager, let me paint you the real picture. This girl, she's basically Roman royalty. Her great-great-grandmother was Octavia, Augustus's own sister. You know Augustus, right? The first Roman emperor, the guy who basically invented the job? Yeah, Messalina's blood is that blue. Through both her parents, she can trace her lineage back to the founding family of the empire. But here's the thing about being royal blood in Caligula's Rome. It's less of a blessing and more of a target on your back. The closer you are to the throne, the more likely you are to end up with a dagger between your ribs. It's like being related to the mob boss. Sure, you get invited to all the best parties, but you also might not make it home from one. So what does a smart 17-year-old aristocrat do in this situation? She marries the least threatening man in the Imperial family. Enter Claudius, and oh boy, what a character he was. Picture the exact opposite of what you'd expect from Roman nobility. He's 47 years old, so 30 years older than our Messalina. He drools when he speaks. He stammers. He limps. His own mother called him a monster of a man. I'm not making this up. That's an actual quote from Antonia Minor. Imagine your own mum saying that about you. Rough, right? Caligula kept him around as basically the court jester. He'd make Claudius run beside his chariot wearing full senatorial robes in the scorching Roman sun, just for laughs. At dinner parties, if Claudius dozed off, which happened a lot because the poor guy probably had narcolepsy, guests would pelt him with olive pits and date stones. They'd put slippers on his hands while he slept, so when he woke up and rubbed his eyes, well, you get the picture. It was basically middle school bullying, but with togas and absolute power. Now you might be thinking, why on earth would this gorgeous, well-connected teenage girl marry this stammering, drooling, limping older man who's the laughingstock of Rome? And that, my friends, is exactly why Messalina was a genius. While everyone else was fighting for power and dying for it, she chose the one man nobody saw as a threat. Claudius wasn't just unmarriageable by Roman standards, he was practically invisible. The family kept him hidden away, studying history and writing books. He was the nerdy uncle everyone forgot existed until they needed someone to make fun of. But Messalina saw something others didn't. Or maybe she just understood the game better. See, in Roman politics, being underestimated was sometimes the best armor you could wear. And Claudius? He'd been underestimated his entire life. He'd survived the reign of Tiberius, who murdered most of his family. He survived Caligula's madness by playing the fool. This wasn't just some bumbling idiot. This was a survivor. The wedding itself must have been interesting. I mean, imagine the gossip. Here's this beautiful teenager from one of Rome's most prestigious families, and she's marrying him. The whispers must have been deafening. She must be desperate. Her family must have debts. Maybe there's something wrong with her. But Messalina walked down the aisle with her head held high because she knew something they didn't. In a world where being powerful got you killed, being married to the powerless might just keep you alive. Their wedding night. Well, Roman historians love to speculate about that, but let's keep it classy. What we do know is that within a year, Messalina was pregnant. And not just once. She gave Claudius 2 children in quick succession. A daughter, Octavia, in 39 CE, and then a son, Britannicus. And that son? That's where everything changes. Because in Rome, producing a male heir wasn't just about continuing the family name, it was about securing power. You have to understand, Claudius had been married twice before, and neither marriage produced surviving male heirs. He was pushing 50, in terrible health by all accounts, and suddenly, here's this teenage wife giving him not just children, but a son. A legitimate, healthy son who could carry on the family name. In Roman terms, Messalina had just made herself indispensable. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Remember how I mentioned Caligula was mad? Well, madness in absolute rulers tends to escalate. By 41 CE, he'd gone from amusing eccentric to full-blown tyrant. He was demanding to be worshipped as a living god. He was sleeping with senators' wives just to humiliate them. He was emptying the treasury on insane building projects. The empire had had enough. On January 24th, 41 CE, a group of Praetorian guards cornered Caligula in a narrow palace corridor. They stabbed him 30 times. They killed his wife. They even killed his infant daughter. Smashed her head against a wall, if you believe the sources. It was brutal, even by Roman standards. In the chaos that followed, something absolutely nobody expected happened. The Praetorian Guard, these were the emperor's personal bodyguards, basically ancient secret service, they're ransacking the palace, and one soldier notices a pair of feet sticking out from behind a curtain. He pulls it back, and there's Claudius, trembling, probably thinking he's about to join his nephew in the afterlife. But instead of killing him, the guards do something extraordinary. They declare him emperor. Why? Well, partly because he was the last adult male of the Julio-Claudian line, but mostly because they needed someone, anyone, to maintain order. And Claudius, he was perfect. He was malleable, grateful, and most importantly, he immediately promised them a massive bonus for their loyalty. Smart man. And just like that, our 17-year-old Messalina goes from being married to the family embarrassment to being the Empress of Rome, the most powerful woman in the known world. Imagine that upgrade. One day you're the wife of the court jester, the next day you're basically a living goddess. Cities mint coins with your face on them. Poets write verses about your beauty. When you walk through the streets, people literally bow. But power in Rome was never simple, and Messalina was about to discover that being empress meant having a target on your back that made her previous situation look like a peaceful garden party. Because now she wasn't just protecting herself from a mad emperor's whims. Now she had real enemies. Senators who thought Claudius was an embarrassment to Rome. other women from noble families who thought they should be Empress instead, and most dangerously, freedmen, former slaves who actually ran the empire's administration, who saw this teenage Empress as either a tool to be used or a threat to be eliminated. The game she'd been playing just got infinitely more dangerous. And Messalina, she was about to show Rome that a teenage girl could play it better than anyone expected. But that transformation from young bride to Rome's most powerful and feared woman, that's a story that begins with an unexpected crown and a choice that would shock even the cynical Roman Senate. Our innocent teenager was about to become something else entirely. Picture this moment with me. It's the afternoon of January 24th, 41 CE. Messalina is probably at home, maybe nursing baby Octavia. She's barely 20 years old herself, remember. Then suddenly, there's commotion in the streets, shouting, running. The kind of chaos that in ancient Rome usually meant somebody important was dead. And then soldiers burst through her door. Not to arrest her, not to kill her, but to kneel, to address her as Augusta. Empress. Can you imagine that whiplash? One moment you're the wife of the family joke, and the next armed soldiers are calling you divine. I mean, most of us freak out when we get promoted to manager at work. This girl just got promoted to basically goddess of the known world. But here's what the history books often skip over. Those first terrifying hours. Because while the Praetorian Guard had declared Claudius emperor, the Senate was having none of it. They were actually meeting in emergency session, planning to restore the Republic. Yeah, you heard that right. For about 48 hours, Rome teetered on the edge of civil war. The Senate had their own candidate picked out and everything. Claudius was literally hiding in the Praetorian camp, terrified. According to Suetonius, he spent the entire first night expecting to be murdered at any moment. He wouldn't eat anything unless his German bodyguards, and yes, he specifically trusted Germans over Romans at this point, tasted it first. The man who'd survived by being harmless suddenly had the most dangerous job in the world, and he knew it. But Messalina, this is where we see the first glimpse of who she really was. While her husband cowered, she acted. She understood something fundamental about Roman power that even seasoned politicians missed. It wasn't about the Senate anymore. It was about the army. And who controlled the army? The Praetorians who just made her husband emperor. She allegedly, and I say allegedly because our sources here get a bit theatrical, she allegedly put on her finest clothes, took baby Britannicus in her arms, and appeared before the Praetorian Guard. Picture this, a 20-year-old woman holding an infant, facing thousands of hardened soldiers, and she doesn't beg. She doesn't cry. She reminds them that this baby is the grandson of Germanicus. Now, if you don't know who Germanicus was, imagine if Captain America and Alexander the Great had a baby, and that baby grew up to be the most beloved general Rome ever produced. The soldiers worshipped his memory. His death in 19 CE under suspicious circumstances had nearly caused a military revolt. And here's his grandson, in the arms of this young empress. The Praetorians went wild. They chanted Britannicus's name. They swore to defend the Imperial family. And just like that, Messalina had turned her infant son into a political weapon. The Senate could talk all they wanted about restoring the Republic, but try explaining to 20,000 armed soldiers why you're overthrowing the grandson of their greatest hero. Within 2 days, the Senate caved. They confirmed Claudius as emperor, and Messalina officially became Augusta, a title that meant she was not just the emperor's wife, but a sacred person in her own right. Her image would appear on coins. Prayers would be offered in her name. In the eastern provinces, temples would be built to worship her as a living goddess. The transformation was instant and absolute. The girl who'd married the family embarrassment now had more power than any woman in Roman history except maybe Livia, Augustus's wife. But unlike Livia, who'd taken decades to build her power base, Messalina had it handed to her overnight. She was completely unprepared and completely unrestrained. Think about it. Have you ever seen what happens when someone wins the lottery? How they go a little crazy with sudden wealth. Now multiply that by 1,000, add absolute power, and subtract any real supervision. That was Messalina in early 41 CE. The first thing she did was redecorate. And I don't mean she bought new curtains. She transformed the Imperial palace into something out of a fantasy. Golden ceilings, walls covered in pearls, dining couches made from tortoiseshell and ivory. She commissioned a statue of herself that was so massive it could be seen from across the forum. Subtle, right? But the real power move came with the birth of Britannicus in February 41st CE. Yes, you heard that right. February 41st CE. Caligula was killed in January, which means Messalina was already heavily pregnant when Claudius became emperor. The timing was almost supernatural. Within weeks of becoming empress, she delivered the one thing that mattered most, a male heir. The Romans went absolutely nuts. Here was Claudius, who everyone thought was impotent or cursed or just too pathetic to produce an heir, and his young wife had given him a son, a healthy, perfect son. The Senate voted honours to Messalina that were unprecedented. She was given the right to travel in the carpentum, a special carriage usually reserved for Vestal virgins. She could sit in the front row at the theatre. Her birthday became a public holiday. But, and here's where it gets interesting, not everyone was celebrating. See, Claudius had a daughter from his second marriage, Antonia. She was married to Pompey Magnus, and they'd been the assumed heirs. Suddenly, they were nobody. Then there were Caligula's sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina the Younger, who'd been exiled by their brother but were still alive, still ambitious, and still had better bloodlines than Messalina. The Game of Thrones had begun, and our 20-year-old Empress was playing against women who'd been training for this their whole lives. What would you do in her position? You're barely out of your teens, you have 2 small children to protect, and you're surrounded by people who'd happily see you dead if it meant their own advancement. Messalina's solution was brilliantly simple and utterly ruthless. Strike first. But she couldn't just start executing people. She wasn't Caligula. She needed to be smarter. She needed allies. And this is where those freedmen I mentioned earlier come in. See, Claudius had a unique problem. The Senate hated him. They thought he was an embarrassment, a drooling fool who'd been forced on them by the army. So he couldn't trust Roman administrators. Instead, he relied on Greek former slaves who'd worked their way up through the imperial household. These men, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, they actually ran the empire. They controlled the treasury, the correspondence, the petitions. They had more real power than most senators, and 20-year-old Messalina, instead of being threatened by them, made them her best friends. She understood that in this new Rome, the power wasn't in the Senate house or even in the army, it was in the bureaucracy. Whoever controlled the information controlled the empire. By the end of 41 CE, less than a year into her reign as Empress, Messalina had completely transformed. The teenager who'd married for safety had become a political operator of the highest order. She had the army's loyalty through Britannicus. She had the administration's support through the freedmen. She had the people's adoration through her youth and beauty and the magnificent public games she sponsored. But she also had something else, something that would become her trademark, a reputation for sexual excess that was already beginning to spread through Roman society. Was it true? Was it slander? Was it something else entirely? a carefully crafted image designed to make her seem too scandalous to be dangerous. The truth lies buried in the complex web of the imperial court, where your closest ally could become your deadliest enemy with a whispered word in the right ear. And in that world, Messalina was about to discover that having power and keeping power were two very different games. Now let me tell you about the strangest power structure in history, a shadow government run by former slaves who are richer than senators and more powerful than generals. Welcome to Claudius's court, where the real puppet masters weren't wearing togas. Imagine walking into the imperial palace in 42 CE. You'd expect to find Roman nobles, right? Senators in their purple stripes, generals with their military honors. But instead, you'd find 3 Greek men who just years earlier had been property. Literal property. And now, they basically ran the world. I'm not exaggerating. These 3 freedmen controlled more wealth than some entire provinces. First, there was Narcissus. He was Claudius's secretary of correspondence, which sounds boring until you realize that meant every single letter to the emperor went through him. Every petition, every report from the provinces, every military dispatch. If you wanted to reach Claudius, you went through Narcissus. The man reportedly had a personal fortune of 400 million sesterces. To put that in perspective, you needed just 1 million to qualify for the Senate. This former slave was worth 400 senators. Then you had Pallas, the financial secretary. He controlled the imperial treasury. Every tax payment, every bribe, gift, to the emperor, every payment to the armies, went through his hands. And you know what they say about handling money. Some of it tends to stick to your fingers. Pallas was so wealthy that when he died, Pliny the Elder listed him as one of the richest men who ever lived, a former slave. Finally, there was Callistus, who handled petitions. Basically, if you wanted a favor from the emperor, a governorship, a pardon, permission to marry whatever, you needed Callistus on your side. He had served under Caligula and somehow survived that lunatic's reign, which tells you everything about his survival instincts. These 3 men were universally despised by the Roman elite. Can you imagine the humiliation? You're a senator, your family has been noble for centuries, and you have to bow and scrape to a former slave just to get an appointment with the emperor. The historian Tacitus practically spits with rage when he writes about them. But here's the thing, they were incredibly good at their jobs. The empire ran more efficiently under them than it had under the proper Roman administrators. Now, most Roman noblewomen would have seen these freedmen as beneath their notice. After all, in Roman society, a freedman could never truly wash off the stain of slavery. They couldn't hold office. Their children were looked down upon. They were rich and powerful, sure, but they were still outsiders. But Messalina, she did something revolutionary. She befriended them. No, actually, she did more than that. She made herself indispensable to them. See, these freedmen had a problem. They had all this power, but it was completely dependent on Claudius staying alive and in charge. If he died, they were done. The next emperor would bring in his own people, and Claudius was not exactly the picture of health. The man was pushing 60, had tremors, probably suffered from cerebral palsy, and let's just say the imperial food tasters earned their wages. So when this 20-something empress approached them with a proposition, "Help me protect my son's inheritance, and I'll make sure you keep your positions when he becomes emperor," they listened. It was brilliant. Messalina wasn't threatening them or trying to dominate them. She was offering them the one thing they desperately needed: long-term security. The alliance worked like this. The freedmen would filter information to Claudius in ways that benefited Messalina. In return, she would use her influence to protect them from the senators who wanted them gone. It was a perfect symbiotic relationship. Well, perfect for them. Not so perfect for anyone who got in their way. Let me give you an example of how this worked. In 42 CE, a senator named Appius Silanus was summoned to Rome to marry Messalina's mother. Good match, right? Powerful senator, imperial connection. But then Silanus made a fatal error. He rejected Messalina's advances, or maybe he just looked at her wrong. Or maybe he was getting too powerful. The sources disagree. Here's what happened next, and honestly, it's so clever it's almost admirable. Messalina went to Narcissus with a plan. The next morning, Narcissus burst into Claudius's bedroom, and remember, this is a paranoid emperor who survived multiple assassination attempts, and says, "Caesar, I had the most terrible dream. I saw Appius Silanus murdering you." Before Claudius can even process this, Messalina sits up in bed and goes, "Oh my gods, I had the exact same dream, 5 nights in a row." Now, Romans were super superstitious about dreams. They believed dreams could predict the future, so 2 people having the same prophetic dream. That's basically proof. But here's the kicker. Narcissus had already arranged for Silanus to arrive at the palace that exact morning for an early meeting. So right on cue, a guard announces that Silanus is here to see the emperor. At dawn, unscheduled, just like in the dream. Claudius completely freaks out. He orders Silanus executed on the spot. No trial, no investigation. The man was dead before breakfast. And the beauty of it, even if Claudius later suspected he'd been played, what could he do? Admit he'd executed a senator based on a dream? He'd look like an idiot. Messalina and Narcissus had him trapped. This became their signature move. The freedmen would handle the bureaucratic side. Forged documents, managed information, controlled access. Messalina would handle the personal side. Dreams, omens, whispered suspicions in bed. Together, they were unstoppable. But here's what's really fascinating, and what most historians miss. This wasn't just about power for power's sake. Remember, Messalina had 2 young children in a world where imperial children had a nasty habit of dying mysteriously. Every senator who got too powerful, every general who got too popular, every distant relative with a claim to the throne, they were all potential threats to Britannicus and Octavia. Think about it from her perspective. You're 22 years old. Your husband is 3 times your age and not exactly in peak health. You've got a 2-year-old son who's supposed to inherit the most powerful position in the world, and half of Rome thinks your husband is a joke who shouldn't even be emperor. What do? You make sure anyone who might harm your children disappears before they get the chance. The freedmen understood this perfectly. They had their own children to protect, their own futures to secure. So they formed this weird, incredibly effective shadow government. The senators could sneer all they wanted about government by former slaves and a teenage empress. But the taxes got collected, the armies got paid, the empire kept running. There was just one problem with this arrangement. Power corrupts, and absolute power. Well, you know how that goes. And when you combine that corruption with a young woman who'd never been told no in her life, who had the freedmen of Rome ready to destroy anyone she pointed at, let's just say the bodies were about to start piling up. And some of those bodies would belong to people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or catching the Empress's eye when she was in one of her moods. The first victim nobody saw coming was a woman who should have been untouchable. Her name was Julia Livilla, and she was Caligula's youngest sister. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just any Roman noblewoman. This was imperial blood. The great-granddaughter of Augustus. A woman who'd survived Caligula's madness. But in 41 CE, within months of Messalina becoming empress, Julia Livilla was suddenly arrested on charges of adultery. Now, adultery was technically illegal in Rome, but come on, half the Senate was sleeping with people they weren't married to. It only became a problem when someone powerful wanted it to be a problem, and Messalina wanted it to be a very big problem. The official story, according to Tacitus, and remember, he's writing about 60 years after the fact, so take it with a grain of salt, was that Julia Livilla had been having an affair with the famous philosopher Seneca. Yes, that Seneca, the guy who'd later become Nero's tutor and one of Rome's greatest Stoic philosophers. At this point, he was just a rising senator with a gift for words and a dangerous connection to the Imperial family. Here's what makes this fascinating. Seneca had been Julia Livilla's alleged lover since 38 CE. That's 3 years of Rome knowing about it and nobody caring. But suddenly, in late 41 CE, it becomes a scandal worthy of exile. What changed? Messalina became empress. That's what changed. Let me paint you the real picture. Julia Livilla represented everything Messalina wasn't. She was older, more experienced, and, this is crucial, she had better bloodlines. Julia Livilla was descended from Augustus through both her mother and father. Messalina's connection was more distant. In the brutal calculus of imperial succession, if anything happened to baby Britannicus, Julia Livilla's children would have a stronger claim to the throne than Messalina's. But you can't just execute a member of the imperial family because you're worried about future what-ifs. You need a crime. Enter the adultery charge, helpfully provided by those freedmen we talked about. Narcissus discovered letters. Pallas found witnesses. Before Julia Livilla could even mount a defense, she was on a ship to the island of Pandateria. And Seneca, he was exiled to Corsica. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Seneca wrote extensively during his exile, and years later, in his philosophical works, he makes some pretty pointed remarks about women who use men as pawns and the dangers of unchecked female power. I wonder who he was talking about. Tacitus certainly had no doubt. He explicitly names Messalina as the architect of Seneca's downfall. But the really chilling part comes a year later. In 42 CE, Julia Livilla mysteriously died on Pandateria. The official cause? The sources don't even bother to give one. She just died. How convenient, right? A 24-year-old woman in perfect health suddenly drops dead on a remote island, where the only people around are guards loyal to Messalina. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century CE, doesn't mince words. He says Messalina had her murdered because she was beautiful and had been intimate with Claudius. Wait, what? So now the story is that Claudius had an affair with Julia Livilla before marrying Messalina? Or was this just ancient gossip? We'll never know for sure, but here's what we do know. A potential rival to Messalina's power was conveniently eliminated and nobody was allowed to ask questions. Think about the message this sent to everyone watching. If Messalina could destroy an imperial princess, what chance did anyone else have? Now, I mentioned Appius Silanus earlier and that clever dream scheme, but there's another dimension to that story that's absolutely wild. According to Suetonius, who, let's be honest, loved a good scandalous story, the real reason Silanus had to die was that he'd rejected Messalina's advances. She'd propositioned him, he'd said no, and that was his death sentence. Can you imagine being in his position? You're a respected senator. You've been married into the imperial family, everything seems great. Then the 20-year-old empress makes it clear she's interested, and you have to make a choice. Say yes, and you're committing adultery with the emperor's wife. That's a death sentence. Say no, and you've insulted the empress. Also a death sentence. There was literally no right answer. The man was dead from the moment she looked at him. The execution happened so fast that Silenus barely had time to understand what was happening. 1 minute he's being summoned to the palace for an early meeting, the next he's being dragged to the dungeon. Dio says he was hurled from the Tarpeian rock. That's the traditional Roman execution method for traitors, where they literally threw you off a cliff, for a dream that 2 people allegedly had. But here's where Messalina showed her true genius, or her true madness, depending on how you look at it. She didn't just eliminate threats, she took their stuff. And I'm not talking about pocket change, I'm talking about their entire estates. Let me tell you about Valerius Asiaticus. Now this guy, he was something special. Twice consul. That's like being prime minister twice in our terms. Incredibly wealthy. Owner of the gardens of Lucullus, which were basically the ancient Roman equivalent of owning Central Park. These gardens were legendary. They'd been built by Lucullus, the general who conquered Pontus, and they featured things that would blow your mind. Imported trees from across the empire, fountains with moving sculptures, a theatre, artificial lakes. Having dinner there was the ultimate status symbol in Rome. Asiaticus was also something that made him particularly dangerous in Messalina's eyes. He was popular. The people loved him. The Senate respected him. And according to Tacitus, he'd openly criticized Caligula's murder. Not because he liked Caligula. Nobody liked Caligula. But because he thought the Praetorian Guard had overstepped their authority. Does that sound like someone who'd be thrilled about Claudius, who was basically installed by those same Praetorians? Messalina certainly didn't think so, but more importantly, and Tacitus is very clear about this, Messalina wanted those gardens. She was obsessed with them. She'd walk past them and just stare. It was like watching someone window shopping for real estate, except the price was a human life. The charges against Asiaticus were beautifully crafted, I'll give them that. They accused him of adultery with Poppaea Sabina, one of the most beautiful women in Rome, and of effeminacy. Now, that effeminacy charge is particularly nasty. In Roman culture, being called effeminate wasn't just an insult, it was a political attack. It meant you were unfit for public life, that you couldn't be trusted with power because you weren't manly enough. The evidence? Apparently Asiaticus had spent too much money beautifying those gardens. He'd put too much thought into the landscaping. He'd cared too much about flowers and fountains. Therefore, obviously, he must be plotting against the emperor. That's the logic they went with. I'm not making this up. This is what Tacitus reports. The trial itself was a farce. It was held in the Imperial bedchamber. Yes, you read that right, in Claudius and Messalina's bedroom, with Messalina herself present to observe. Narcissus prosecuted. The entire thing was designed to humiliate Asiaticus before killing him. But here's where something unexpected happened. Asiaticus gave a speech that, according to Tacitus, moved everyone in the room to tears. Everyone except Messalina. He talked about his service to Rome. He mentioned his friendship with Claudius's brother Germanicus. He spoke about his love for those gardens, how they were his life's work, how he'd hoped to leave them to the Roman people in his will. And then, and this is the part that gives me chills, he realized he was going to die no matter what he said. So he looked directly at Messalina and said, "You want my gardens? Fine, you can have them, but you'll never enjoy them." Then he turned to Claudius and asked for one favor, the right to choose how he died. Roman law allowed condemned nobles to commit suicide rather than face execution. It was considered more honorable. Claudius, possibly feeling some genuine remorse, agreed. Asiaticus went home, had one last meal, went to his beloved gardens one final time, opened his veins in the bath and bled out surrounded by the beauty he'd spent his life creating. It was 47 CE. Messalina had been Empress for 6 years. She was 24 years old and had just acquired the most beautiful property in Rome by having its owner driven to suicide. The gardens of Lucullus would become her favourite residence, the place where she held her most notorious parties. And here's the twisted irony that I don't think we can ignore. Asiaticus's curse came true. Messalina would die in those very gardens just 1 year later, hunted down like an animal by the same Imperial guards who'd helped her seize them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What fascinates me about these purges is how systematic they were. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't paranoia. This was calculated political elimination. Every single victim had something Messalina wanted, either their power, their property, or their silence. Julia Livilla had bloodline legitimacy. Seneca had influence and could speak against her. Silanus had refused her. Asiaticus had those gardens and popular support. You know what this reminds me of? It's like watching someone play chess while everyone else thinks they're playing checkers. Messalina wasn't just reacting to threats. She was anticipating them, eliminating them before they could even materialize. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. Was she protecting her children, or was she drunk on power? Because from one angle, you could argue she was doing what any mother would do, securing her son's future in a world where Imperial children died with alarming regularity. From another angle, she was a 20-something-year-old woman with absolute power and no supervision, taking whatever she wanted because she could. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, which makes it even more disturbing. Because imagine being able to point at someone and have them destroyed. No real trial, no genuine investigation, just your word against theirs, and your word is backed by the Emperor's guards and the richest freedmen in the empire. How long before you start believing you deserve that power? How long before other people's lives become just pieces on your game board? By 47 CE, whispers were spreading through Rome. Senators would go pale when summoned to the palace. Wives would beg their husbands not to attend imperial dinners. And through it all, Messalina kept smiling, kept hosting her parties in those stolen gardens, kept playing the role of devoted wife and mother. But the whispers weren't just about political murders anymore. They were about something else entirely, something that would become the defining narrative of Messalina's reign. Because while she was eliminating rivals, she was apparently also doing something that would scandalize Rome for centuries to come. The question is, were those stories true? Or were they just another weapon in Rome's endless political wars, one that would prove far more effective than any army? Because what's the best way to destroy a powerful woman in a patriarchal society? You can't beat her politically, you can't outmaneuver her bureaucratically, and you can't challenge her militarily. But you can destroy her reputation. You can make her name synonymous with sexual depravity so extreme that people will remember the scandal long after they've forgotten the politics. And that's exactly what happened to Messalina. But the story of how the brothel Empress legend was born? That's where things get really interesting. Here's the story that's defined Messalina for 2,000 years. The story that makes historians blush and tabloids salivate. The story that's been retold in countless books, plays, and even a 1960s exploitation film. But before I tell you what allegedly happened in that brothel in the Subura district, I need you to understand something crucial. Not a single person who wrote this story down was alive when it supposedly happened. Let that sink in for a moment. Everything we know about Messalina's sexual escapades comes from men writing 70 to 80 years after her death. Men who never met her. Men who are writing under different emperors with different political agendas. Men who had every reason to paint the previous dynasty as depraved monsters to make their current rulers look better by comparison. But let's dive into the legend anyway, because whether it's true or not, it tells us something fascinating about Roman society and how they destroyed powerful women. The most famous story comes from Pliny the Elder's Natural History, written around 77 CE. That's almost 30 years after Messalina died. Pliny was a serious guy, a naval commander and naturalist who documented everything from elephant behavior to volcanic eruptions. He's the one who died investigating Mount Vesuvius, so we're not talking about some gossip columnist here. Which makes what he wrote even more shocking. Pliny claims that Messalina, the Empress of Rome, competed against Rome's most famous prostitute, a woman named Scylla, in an endurance contest. The challenge. Who could sleep with more men in a single night? And according to Pliny, Messalina won by servicing 25 men in 24 hours. He presents this not as rumour, but as documented fact. He literally writes, "I find in the notes of recorded events that Messalina achieved this feat. 25 men. 25. Let me put this in perspective. Pliny is essentially claiming that the Empress of Rome abandoned her palace, her guards, her children, her entire identity, and spent an entire night having sex with random men just to win a bet against a prostitute. And somehow, this was recorded in official documents. Can you spot the problem here? Because there are about 17 problems with this story. First, where exactly are these recorded events Pliny mentions? He doesn't cite them. No surviving Roman document mentions this. No contemporary historian, and trust me, they documented everything, wrote about it while Messalina was alive or immediately after her death. This is supposedly one of the most scandalous events in Roman history, and nobody thought to mention it for 3 decades. Second, the logistics. Roman imperial women didn't just pop out for a night on the town. They travelled with bodyguards, attendants, servants. The Empress couldn't sneeze without 10 people knowing about it. The idea that she could disappear into a brothel for an entire night without anyone noticing, in a city where political spies were everywhere, come on. But the story gets even more elaborate with Juvenal, the satirist writing in the early 2nd century CE. That's 60 years after Messalina's death. In his 6th satire, which is basically a misogynistic rant about why Roman men shouldn't marry, he paints this picture of Messalina that's become iconic. He claims she would leave the palace at night, disguise herself with a blonde wig, and work in a brothel under the name Lysiska, the wolf girl. Juvenal writes that she would take the last empty cell in the brothel and sell herself throughout the night, and then, this is his exact phrase, she would leave reluctantly, still burning with desire, her cheeks begrimed with smoke, taking back to the imperial bed the stench of the brothel. It's vivid, it's visceral, it's also completely unverifiable. And here's the thing about Juvenal. He wasn't writing history. He was writing satire. His entire purpose was to exaggerate and shock. Taking Juvenal literally is like watching South Park and assuming it's a documentary. His 6th satire is such an over-the-top attack on women that scholars today read it as deliberate parody. He claims all women are terrible, using Messalina as the ultimate example. Then there's Tacitus, arguably the most reliable of our sources, writing his annals around 115 CE, 67 years after Messalina died. Now, Tacitus is interesting because he's usually careful. He distinguishes between what he knows and what he's heard. When he discusses Messalina, he says she prostituted herself in the palace and that she would compete with prostitutes. But notice the difference. He doesn't give us the specific Scylla story. He doesn't claim she worked in brothels. He's more vague, more careful, and even Tacitus admits his sources are problematic. At one point he literally writes, "I am aware that to many this will seem incredible, but I am not inventing marvels. What I am relating is what has been heard and recorded by my elders. In other words, look, I didn't see this, and it sounds crazy, but older people told me it happened. That's not exactly rock-solid evidence, is it? Suetonius, writing around 121 CE, adds his own colourful details in his biography of Claudius. He claims Messalina was so insatiable that she would exhaust multiple partners and still want more. But again, Suetonius was writing 73 years after the fact, and his entire biographical style was to include every scandalous rumour he'd ever heard, whether he believed it or not. So here we have 4 writers, Pliny, Juvenal, Tacitus and Suetonius, all writing between 30 and 80 years after Messalina's death, all repeating versions of the same story, but none of them were there. None of them cite contemporary sources, and all of them were writing under the Flavian or later dynasties, who had every political reason to make the previous Julio-Claudian emperors look as bad as possible. You know what this is called in historical analysis? It's called a propaganda feedback loop. One person writes something scandalous, the next historian reads it and adds to it, the next one embroiders it further until you've got a legend that's been building for decades, and nobody remembers that it started as unverified gossip. Think about how rumours work in your own life. Someone says they heard something about someone. The next person adds a detail. The third person swears they know someone who was there. Before you know it, a story that started as, "I think Jenny might have kissed someone at the party," becomes, "Jenny definitely had sex with 5 guys in the bathroom while her boyfriend was right outside." Now multiply that by 70 years and add in political motivations to destroy someone's reputation. That's what we're dealing with. Here's what makes me really skeptical. Rome had actual laws about adultery. It was technically illegal and technically punishable by exile or death. We have records of senators being prosecuted for sleeping with imperial women. We have documentation of actual scandals. But there's no contemporary legal record of Messalina being caught in a brothel. No trial. No witnesses coming forward at the time. Nothing. If even half of what the later historians claim was true, wouldn't someone have mentioned it while she was alive? Wouldn't her enemies, and she had plenty, have used it against her? But the historical record from her actual lifetime is silent on these sexual scandals. The accusations only appear decades later. Let me ask you something. What's the most effective way to destroy a woman's legacy in a patriarchal society? You can't say she was stupid. Messalina clearly wasn't. You can't say she was weak. She accumulated real power. You can't say she was a bad mother. By all accounts, she was protective of her children. So what do? You make her sexually deviant. You make her so scandalously lustful that people forget everything else about her. And it works. It's worked for 2,000 years. Ask anyone about Messalina, and they'll mention the brothel stories. Ask them about her actual political manoeuvring, her alliance with the freedmen, her systematic elimination of rivals, and you'll get blank stares. This wasn't unique to Messalina. Look at Cleopatra. Roman historians painted her as a seductress who used sex to manipulate Caesar and Antony, conveniently ignoring that she was a brilliant politician who spoke 9 languages and ran Egypt competently for 20 years. Look at Agrippina the Younger, accused of sleeping with her son Nero. Look at Theodora, the Byzantine empress. The historian Procopius claimed she'd been a prostitute who performed obscene acts on stage, stories that modern historians largely discount as character assassination. There's a pattern here. Powerful women in the ancient world get sexualized and demonized. Their political agency gets erased and replaced with stories of insatiable lust. It's so predictable, it's almost boring. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is the part that keeps me up at night. What if some of it was true? but not in the way we think. Stay with me here. What if Messalina did use sex as a political weapon, but in a completely calculated way? Romans themselves documented that she would seduce men and then blackmail them. Tacitus mentions this explicitly. Senators who slept with the Empress could be accused of adultery with the imperial woman, a capital offence. So you sleep with her, and now she owns you. Refuse her advances and you're dead, like Appius Silenus. It's a trap with no escape. That's not sexual depravity. That's political genius. Terrifying political genius, but genius nonetheless. And what if the prostitute stories were deliberately spread by Messalina's enemies to accomplish two things? Destroy her reputation so thoroughly that no one would believe anything she said in her defense, and create such a scandal that Claudius would have no choice but to execute her? Because that's exactly what happened. When the final crisis came in 48 CE, and oh boy, we'll get to that train wreck, Claudius was bombarded with these sexual stories, and he believed them because he'd been hearing versions of them for years. The propaganda had done its job. Think about the timing. All these writers are composing their works under later dynasties. The Flavians, who overthrew the Julio-Claudians, needed to justify their coup by making the previous dynasty look monstrous. What better way than to paint them as sexual deviants? Caligula was crazy and incestuous. Nero would be portrayed as matricidal and perverse. And Messalina? She became the prostitute empress. It's almost too convenient. 4 male historians writing decades later, all agreeing that this one woman was uniquely, impossibly depraved. No nuance, no complexity, just pure, simple villainy wrapped up in sexual scandal. I'm not saying Messalina was innocent. The political murders we talked about, those are documented by contemporary sources. Her accumulation of property through executions, that happened. Her alliance with the freedmen and systematic elimination of rivals, absolutely real. Messalina was ruthless, calculating, and probably terrifying to be around. But the prostitute empress who competed with Sylla for the most partners in one night, the woman who couldn't control her sexual appetites, that might be the greatest character assassination in Roman history, a way to reduce a politically brilliant, if morally questionable, woman into a one-dimensional caricature that would be easier to condemn and easier to forget. What do you think? I'm genuinely curious. When you hear these stories, does it feel like truth, or does it feel like propaganda? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this question has puzzled historians for centuries. The sad reality is we'll never know for certain what Messalina actually did in her private life. What we do know is that she was powerful, she was feared, and she made enemies who wanted her destroyed. And in Rome, destroying someone's reputation was sometimes more effective than destroying their body. But reputation wasn't the only thing at stake as Messalina entered her final years as empress. Because while her enemies were whispering about brothels and prostitutes, she was playing a much more dangerous game, one involving the most beautiful man in Rome and a scandal so shocking that it would make even the made-up prostitute stories seem tame by comparison. Let's talk about the specific details of that infamous competition with Sylla, because the more you examine this story, the more absurd it becomes. And I mean that in the most literal sense, absurd as in defying logic and physical possibility. Pliny the Elder, in Book 10 of his Natural History, doesn't just mention this story in passing. He presents it as a serious entry in a discussion about human endurance and natural limits. He's literally comparing Messalina's alleged sexual stamina to examples of unusual animal behavior and extreme human feats. He writes, Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, thinking this a palm quite worthy of an empress, selected for the purpose of deciding the question, one of the most notorious of the women who followed the profession of a hired prostitute, and in a competition which lasted through the whole night, overcame her after going through 25 embraces. 25 embraces in one night. Let me walk you through why this is, from a purely practical standpoint, impossible. First, let's do the math. A full night. Let's be generous and say 12 hours from sunset to sunrise. That's 720 minutes. Divided by 25 men equals roughly 29 minutes per encounter, but that's assuming 0 breaks, 0 recovery time, and that each encounter happens immediately after the previous one ends. No bathroom breaks, no water, nothing. Now, I'm going to get a bit clinical here, but we need to talk about the physical realities. Modern medical research, and yes, there are studies on this because of course there are, shows that the human body has limits. The act itself causes physical trauma at those frequencies. We're talking about tissue damage, dehydration, exhaustion. After a certain point, the body literally cannot continue without serious medical consequences. But let's say, hypothetically, Messalina had superhuman stamina. There's still the other side of this equation. The men. Pliny says 25 different men. Where did they come from? Did they line up? Did someone organize this? Did they draw numbers? Excuse me, sir, you're number 17. Please wait over there by the wine jugs. And here's something Pliny conveniently doesn't mention. The prostitute Scylla. Who was she? Is there any other record of her existence? Pliny presents her as the most notorious prostitute in Rome, yet no other source mentions her name. Not Martial, who wrote extensively about Rome's sex workers, not Juvenal, who would have loved to include her in his satires, not even the Christian writers who gleefully documented Roman sexual vice. Just Pliny, writing 30 years after Messalina's death, suddenly produces this otherwise unknown prostitute for his anecdote. The historian Nymphidius Sabinus, according to later sources, supposedly kept records of scandalous events at the imperial court. Could this be what Pliny meant by recorded events? Possibly. But Nymphidius was also famous for making up stories. He literally claimed to be Caligula's illegitimate son when he wasn't. Not exactly a reliable source. Let's compare this to other historical endurance records that turned out to be propaganda. Catherine the Great of Russia was rumoured to have died while having sex with a horse. Completely false. She died of a stroke. The story was invented by her political enemies in France. Marie Antoinette was accused of having sex with her own son. Also false. Revolutionary propaganda to justify executing her. Lucrezia Borgia was painted as a murderous seductress who poisoned her lovers. Modern historians now believe most of those stories were invented by her family's political rivals. See the pattern? Powerful woman threatens the status quo. Stories of extreme sexual deviance appear. The stories get repeated until they become common knowledge. And suddenly, that's all anyone remembers about her. What's particularly interesting about Messalina's case is that we can track exactly how the legend grew over time. The earliest references to her promiscuity, from sources closer to her lifetime, are relatively tame. Accusations of having affairs, using sex to manipulate senators, that sort of thing. But with each passing decade, the stories get more extreme. By the time we get to Juvenal in the 2nd century, she's sneaking out in blonde wigs to work in brothels. By the medieval period, she's become a symbol of pure lust in morality plays. By the Renaissance, artists are painting her in increasingly pornographic scenarios. Each generation adds another layer of scandal because the previous version wasn't shocking enough anymore. It's like that game of telephone we all played as kids, except it's being played across centuries and the stakes are someone's entire historical legacy. Now, compare Messalina to Theodora, who became Byzantine Empress in 527 CE, about 480 years after Messalina's death. The historian Procopius wrote a secret history, claiming Theodora had been an actress and prostitute who performed obscene acts on stage, including one involving geese that I'm not going to describe here. These stories sound similar to Messalina's, right? But here's the thing. Modern historians have access to other sources about Theodora, church records, legal documents, contemporary letters, and they paint a completely different picture. She was Justinian's political partner, helped write legal reforms protecting women's rights, built hospitals and churches, and was instrumental in saving the empire during the Nika riots. These sex stories? Almost certainly made up by Procopius, who was angry at Justinian and Theodora for various political reasons. We can prove Procopius lied about Theodora because we have contradictory evidence. We can't prove the Roman historians lied about Messalina because we don't have those alternative sources, but the patterns are identical. Powerful woman, threatened male establishment, sexual character assassination. Or look at Empress Wu Zetian of China, who ruled from 690 to 705 CE. She's the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. The histories written after her death claim she killed her own infant daughter and framed a rival for it, that she had male concubines she executed when she got bored of them, that she was involved in black magic and torture. Sound familiar? Modern analysis of Tang dynasty records shows most of these stories were likely invented by Confucian scholars who were horrified that a woman had dared to claim the dragon throne. They couldn't attack her competence. She was actually a very effective ruler, so they attacked her morality. This is what historians call gendered propaganda. When powerful men do terrible things, the histories record them as strong, ruthless, or pragmatic. Julius Caesar killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more, and we call him a military genius. When powerful women do anything remotely similar, they get sexualized. Their political actions get erased and replaced with stories about who they slept with. Think about it. We remember Messalina for a prostitute competition that probably never happened. We barely remember that she was the mother of Britannicus, who should have been emperor. We forget that she successfully manipulated the most complex political machine in the ancient world for 7 years. We overlook that she accumulated more personal wealth than any woman in Roman history up to that point. All of that gets reduced to the empress who couldn't control her sexual appetite. It's the ultimate erasure. Her political genius, her ruthlessness, her strategic mind, all gone. Replaced with a caricature that fits neatly into patriarchal assumptions about women and power. Of course she couldn't handle power. Women are controlled by their passions. But here's what really gets me about the Scylla story specifically. Even if we assume Messalina did use sex as a political weapon, and there's decent evidence she did, why would she compete with a prostitute? What would be the point? She was the empress. She had unlimited power and wealth. What could she possibly gain from proving she could outlast a sex worker? Unless the story was created to serve a specific purpose, to make her seem not just promiscuous, but insane, not just unfaithful, but psychologically broken. Because a politically calculating woman who uses sex strategically is frightening, but a nymphomaniac who can't control herself, that's just sad. That's someone who deserves pity or disgust, but not fear. And definitely not respect. The Scylla story takes away Messalina's agency. It transforms her from a potential threat into a pathetic figure, and that might have been exactly the point. So when I read Pliny's account of the Scylla competition, I don't see historical fact. I see a character assassination so complete, so total, that it's still working 2,000 years later. I see a woman who scared Rome so badly that they had to turn her into a monster, not a political monster, but a sexual one, because that's the kind of monster that society finds acceptable to hate without guilt. Have you ever noticed how differently we judge historical figures based on gender? We celebrate Alexander the Great's conquests, but condemn Cleopatra's political marriages. We admire Augustus's ruthlessness, but are disgusted by Messalina's. Why is that? Drop your thoughts below, because this double standard has survived millennia, and I think it's worth examining. The tragedy is that the real Messalina, whoever she actually was, is lost beneath these layers of propaganda and scandal. We'll never know if she was a protective mother making terrible choices, a psychopath drunk on power, a brilliant politician playing a game she ultimately lost, or something else entirely. The sexual stories buried everything else. But while Rome was busy inventing prostitute competitions and brothel tales, Messalina was actually building something much more dangerous than a sexual reputation. She was constructing a network of blackmail, intimidation, and control that made her nearly untouchable. And the weapon she used wasn't just sex, it was fear, carefully calculated and ruthlessly applied. So if the brothel stories were mostly propaganda, what was Messalina actually doing? Because Tacitus, even while he's reporting all the scandalous tales, accidentally gives us glimpses of something far more calculated. Something that, honestly, is way more terrifying than any prostitute competition. Tacitus writes in his Annals, Book 11, that Messalina compelled the noblest of the women to prostitute themselves in the palace. Not random women, not common prostitutes. The noblest women of Rome, the wives and daughters of senators. He also mentions that she would force the young nobility of both sexes into debauchery. And here's the critical part. Keeping lists of their names. Lists. She was keeping records. Think about what that means. This wasn't about sexual pleasure. This was about control. She was systematically compromising Rome's elite, both men and women, and documenting it. In a society where adultery was not just scandalous but legally punishable, where your reputation meant everything, where one accusation could destroy your entire family, Messalina was building a blackmail empire, and the genius of it, everyone focused on the sex and missed the politics. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually worked, based on what Tacitus and Cassius Dio tell us. Imagine you're a Roman senator in 45 CE. You're ambitious. You've got your eye on a provincial governorship, maybe a consulship. One day, you receive an invitation to a private dinner at the Imperial Palace. Not a formal state banquet, a private gathering. The Empress herself wants to meet you. You can't refuse. First, because she's the Empress, and refusing her would be an insult to the Imperial family. Second, because maybe this is your chance. Maybe Messalina will mention you to Claudius. Maybe this is how you get that posting you've been dreaming about. So you go. The dinner is lavish, intimate. Maybe 10 or 12 guests, all carefully selected. The wine flows freely, and Roman wine was strong stuff, often mixed with honey and spices to mask its potency. Messalina is charming, attentive, asking about your family, your career, your ambitions. She seems genuinely interested in you. As the evening progresses, the atmosphere changes. The other guests pair off, servants discreetly disappear, and suddenly you find yourself alone with the Empress, and she makes it very clear what she wants. Now, what do? This is the trap I mentioned earlier, but let me spell it out in excruciating detail. If you sleep with her, you've committed adultery with the Emperor's wife. That's treason. The penalty is death. But if you refuse, you've insulted the Empress. You've rejected her advances. Ask Appius Silanus how that worked out for him. Oh wait, you can't, because he was executed based on a fake dream the morning after he rejected her. So you make your choice. Most men, according to Tacitus, chose to sleep with her, figuring at least that way they had a chance of surviving. And the moment you do, you're owned. Because now Messalina has proof. Maybe there were witnesses, those other guests who conveniently disappeared. Maybe there's a servant who can testify. Maybe there's physical evidence, but definitely your name goes on that list. And from that moment on, you do exactly what Messalina tells you to do. Vote the way she wants in the Senate. Support the policies she favors. Attack the people she wants destroyed. Stay silent when she needs silence. Because if you don't, that list becomes public and you're dead. Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, describes Messalina as someone who would become violently angry if anyone scorned her advances. But look closer at what happens to the people who scorn her advances. They don't just face her anger, they face execution, exile, or property confiscation. It's not about wounded pride. It's about eliminating anyone who can't be controlled. This is what modern political scientists would call compromat, compromising material used for blackmail. The KGB perfected it in the 20th century, but Messalina was running the same playbook 2,000 years earlier. Seduce people in positions of power, document it, and then leverage that information to build a network of controlled assets. And it wasn't just men. Tacitus specifically mentions that she forced noble women into these situations too. Why? Because in Roman society, a woman's reputation was even more fragile than a man's. A senator caught in adultery might be exiled. A senator's wife caught in adultery would be divorced, disgraced, and her children declared illegitimate. The stakes for women were even higher. So Messalina targeted wives and daughters of powerful families. She'd invite them to her gatherings, create compromising situations, and suddenly she controlled entire households. The senator can't vote against her because his wife is compromised. The general can't oppose her because his daughter's reputation is in her hands. It's diabolical and brilliant. And absolutely in character for someone who had spent 7 years systematically eliminating political rivals. But here's what really gets me about this strategy. It only works if people believe the sexual stories. If everyone in Rome is gossiping about how Messalina is obsessed with sex, how she can't control her desires, how she's constantly seducing people, then when another senator gets caught in bed with her, people shrug and say, well, of course she seduced him. That's what she does. Poor man couldn't resist. The sexual reputation becomes cover for the political operation. Nobody looks at the pattern. Nobody asks, wait, why are all these senators suddenly voting the same way? They just see another scandal, another affair, another example of Messalina's supposedly uncontrollable lust. Let me give you a specific example that Tacitus documents. There was a young senator named Troilus Montanus. According to Tacitus, Messalina became enamored of him and basically forced him into an affair. But look at what happened after the affair began. Montanus suddenly received a lucrative appointment as procurator in Asia. His family, which had been struggling financially, suddenly had access to imperial funds. And in the Senate, Montanus became one of Messalina's most reliable votes. Tacitus presents this as Messalina rewarding her lover. But flip the script. What if Messalina targeted Montanus specifically because he needed money? What if the affair was the price for the appointment? What if he knew exactly what the deal was? Sleep with the Empress, get the posting, vote her way, and keep your mouth shut. That's not nymphomania. That's transactional politics. That's understanding that in a society where women can't hold office, can't command armies, and can't officially participate in government, sex becomes one of the few tools of power available, and Messalina wielded that tool like a master craftsman. Now, I want to be really clear about something. I'm not defending Messalina. Coercing people into sexual situations through threat of violence is wrong, whether you're male or female, ancient or modern. What she was doing, if even half of what Tacitus reports is true, was systematic sexual coercion backed by state power. That's abuse. Full stop. But we can acknowledge that it was abuse while also recognizing the political genius of the strategy. We can condemn the methods while understanding the context, because Messalina was operating in a system specifically designed to keep women powerless. Roman women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't control property without male guardians. The only power they could access was through their relationships with powerful men, as mothers, wives, daughters, or sexual partners. And Messalina figured out how to weaponize that. She took the one avenue of power Roman society allowed women, sexuality and sexual scandal, and turned it into a political machine. It's like she looked at the patriarchy and said, "Okay, you've decided that women only have power through sex. Fine. Watch me turn that into an empire." There's a feminist reading of Messalina's story that's really compelling. She was navigating a world where women were property, where her value was entirely tied to her ability to produce male heirs, where at any moment her husband could divorce her and leave her with nothing. The only way to secure her position and protect her children was to accumulate power by any means necessary. But there's also a counter-argument that says using sexual coercion as a tool of political control just perpetuates the same patriarchal violence, just with a female perpetrator. That Messalina wasn't subverting the system, she was reinforcing it. Honestly, both readings are probably true. People are complicated. Messalina could be both a victim of Roman patriarchy and an abuser who weaponized that patriarchy against others. She could be both protecting her children and drunk on power. History isn't a Marvel movie with clear heroes and villains. What fascinates me is how effective this strategy was. For 7 years, Messalina controlled Rome through this network of blackmail and coercion. 7 years. Think about how many people had to stay silent. How many senators went home every night knowing they were voting against their conscience because an empress had leverage over them? How many wives whispered to their husbands, "Just do what she says"? Suetonius, in his Life of Claudius, mentions that the emperor was essentially clueless about all of this. He writes that Claudius was unconscious of what was happening in his own household. The man who supposedly ran the empire had no idea his wife was running a parallel power structure right under his nose. Or did he? This is where it gets really interesting. What if Claudius knew, or at least suspected, but chose to ignore it because it was useful? Messalina's network gave him indirect control over senators who would never have supported him directly. She could do the dirty political work while he maintained plausible deniability. It's the same pattern we see in modern politics all the time. The official who doesn't know what their staff is doing. The CEO who's shocked by the corruption happening in their company. Willful blindness is its own form of complicity. But whether Claudius knew or not, the system Messalina built was incredibly fragile, because it all depended on fear and secrecy. Everyone on that list stayed in line because they were afraid of exposure. But what happens if someone decides the exposure is worth it? What happens if someone becomes more afraid of Messalina than they are of scandal? And more importantly, what happens when you build a power structure based entirely on sexual leverage and then you actually fall in love with someone? Because that's exactly what was about to happen, and it would be the beginning of the end. But before we get to the man who would destroy everything Messalina had built, and I promise you that story is absolutely wild, we need to understand one more thing about her. Because underneath all the political maneuvering, all the blackmail and coercion, all the calculated ruthlessness, there was something else driving her. something that makes this whole story infinitely more tragic. She was a mother, and in ancient Rome, being a mother to a future emperor meant your child was always in danger. Every political murder Messalina ordered, every senator she blackmailed, every rival she destroyed, we can trace almost all of it back to one thing: a little boy named Britannicus, born in February 41st CE, who would never live to see his 14th birthday. Being the mother of a future Roman emperor was probably the most dangerous job in the ancient world. And I'm not exaggerating. Let me give you some statistics that will make your blood run cold. Of the first 12 Roman emperors, from Augustus to Domitian, only 3 died of natural causes. 3 out of 12. The rest were murdered, and their families, their children, even worse odds. Tacitus gives us this chilling observation in Book 12 of his Annals. The imperial house was more dangerous to its own members than to strangers. Think about what that means. You were literally safer being a random Roman citizen than being born into the emperor's family. Your own relatives were more likely to kill you than some foreign enemy. Messalina knew this. She'd watched Caligula murder his own family members. She'd seen Tiberius before him do the same. She knew that the moment Claudius died, and remember, he was 60 years old with serious health problems, her 7-year-old son would become the most valuable target in the Roman Empire. Every ambitious senator, every general with an army, every member of the imperial family with even a distant claim to the throne would see Britannicus as either a tool to be controlled or an obstacle to be eliminated. So everything she did, every ruthless calculation, every political murder needs to be viewed through that lens. Was she evil? Was she protective? Maybe she was both. Maybe when your child's life depends on eliminating threats before they materialize, the line between protection and paranoia disappears entirely. Let me tell you about the snake incident, because it's one of those stories that's so bizarre it might actually be true. Suetonius records it in his Life of Claudius, and the details are oddly specific in a way that pure propaganda usually isn't. According to Suetonius, someone, he doesn't say who, but the implication is clear, placed a snake in Britannicus's bed. Not just any snake, but a venomous one. The child was around 5 or 6 years old at the time. The plot was discovered, the snake was removed, and Britannicus survived. But here's the creepy part. Suetonius says that afterward, Messalina insisted that Britannicus wear an amulet at all times. Not just any amulet, a golden bulla containing a snake's shed skin, which Romans believed could ward off poison and evil spirits. Now, you might think, okay, paranoid mother overreacts to a scary incident. But there's more. Tacitus mentions that Claudius's food tasters were constantly being changed, and that Messalina insisted on personally supervising anything that came near her children. We're talking about a level of security that suggests real, persistent threats. Who would want to kill a child? Well, let's talk about the competition. Claudius had other potential heirs, and their mothers had just as much reason to want their sons on the throne as Messalina did. First, there was Claudius's daughter from his second marriage, Antonia. She'd been married to Pompey Magnus, yes, a descendant of Pompey the Great, and they'd been the presumed heirs before Britannicus was born. When Messalina produced a son, Antonia and her husband suddenly became obstacles. Tacitus records that in 47 CE, Pompey Magnus was executed on charges of adultery with Messalina herself. Yes, you read that right. Messalina allegedly had an affair with her stepdaughter's husband, then had him executed for it. But look closer at the timing. Britannicus was 6 years old, getting to the age where succession talk would start becoming serious. Pompey had military connections and a famous name. He was exactly the kind of person who could lead a coup. Was the adultery charge real, or was it just a convenient excuse to eliminate a threat to Britannicus? Then there were Caligula's sisters, who we mentioned earlier. Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla both had sons, or the potential for sons with better bloodlines than Messalina's. Julia Livilla, as we discussed, died mysteriously in exile, but Agrippina? She survived, and she had a son named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who you might know better as Nero. Yeah, that Nero. The future emperor who would make Caligula look stable. Agrippina the Younger was recalled from exile by Claudius in 41 CE, which means for several years she and Messalina were both at court. Can you imagine the tension? Two mothers, both with sons, both knowing that only one child could inherit the throne. Cassius Dio writes that they hated each other with a terrible hatred. That's putting it mildly. According to Dio, Messalina tried multiple times to have Agrippina and her son killed, but couldn't find a way to do it without making it obvious. Agrippina was too well connected, too careful, and, critically, she had support from certain senators who saw her son as a backup plan if something happened to Britannicus. This is the Roman version of Game of Thrones, except the stakes are real and the children actually die. What must it have been like to be Messalina, lying awake at night thinking about all the ways someone could get to her children? Poison in their food, a paid assassin, a convenient accident during a public game, a rebellion that sweeps through the palace. The possibilities were endless, and Roman history showed that they all actually happened. Suetonius tells us that Messalina would sometimes have nightmares and wake up screaming. The sources present this as evidence of her guilty conscience. But what if it was just the natural anxiety of a mother who knew her son was a target? What if every shadow looked like an assassin? Every meal looked like poison? Every friendly senator looked like a potential traitor? Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Messalina also had a daughter, Octavia, who was slightly older than Britannicus. And we know what Messalina was planning for her, because it's documented. She arranged for Octavia to be engaged to Lucius Silanus, a descendant of Augustus with impeccable bloodlines. It was a smart move. Unite potential rival families through marriage, turn possible enemies into allies. But then something interesting happened. According to Tacitus, Messalina suddenly changed her mind about the engagement and instead had Silanus accused of incest with his sister, Julia Calvina. The charges were almost certainly false. Tacitus himself expresses doubt about them. Silanus was forced to resign from public office and later committed suicide. The engagement was broken. Why? What changed? Some historians think Messalina was just being capricious, destroying people for fun. But look at the timeline. This happened in 48 CE, right around the time Messalina was getting involved with Gaius Silius. But we'll get to him in a moment. What if Messalina realized that marrying Octavia off to someone with a strong claim to the throne was actually a threat to Britannicus? What if other senators might rally around Silanus as an alternative emperor, leaving her son vulnerable? So she destroyed him, ruined his reputation, drove him to suicide, eliminated the threat. And Octavia. She eventually married Nero, Agrippina's son, in one of the most tragic marriages in Roman history. But that's a story for another time. What strikes me about all of this is the impossible position Messalina was in. She couldn't just be a mother. She couldn't just love her children and hope for the best. In Roman imperial politics, passive mothers saw their children die. Active mothers, mothers who eliminated threats, who built power networks, who did whatever it took to protect their kids. Those mothers got called monsters. Would you have done differently? If you knew that your child's survival depended on your willingness to destroy anyone who threatened them, could you do it? Could you order executions, ruin lives, manipulate and blackmail and kill, all in the name of protecting your baby? It's an impossible moral question, and I genuinely don't know the answer. Tacitus gives us this really interesting detail. He says that Messalina would bring Britannicus to Senate meetings sometimes, letting him sit on Claudius's lap while the emperor conducted business. On the surface, it seems like a sweet family moment. But think about the message it sent. Every senator in that room could see this child, this little boy who would one day have absolute power over their lives. They could see Messalina watching them, noting their reactions, remembering who seemed too interested, who seemed resentful, who seemed ambitious. It was a power play disguised as parental affection, and it worked. For 7 years, nobody dared openly challenge Britannicus's position as heir. Nobody suggested that maybe Claudius should adopt someone older, more experienced. The senatorial class learned that questioning Britannicus's succession was a quick way to end up dead, exiled, or ruined. But here's the tragic irony. All of Messalina's plotting, all her murders, all her careful protection of Britannicus, it didn't matter in the end. Because the real threat to her son didn't come from rival claimants or ambitious senators. It came from her own decisions, from her own inability to stop playing the game even when she had already won. By 47 CE, Messalina had achieved something remarkable. Britannicus was healthy, growing, and accepted by Rome as the heir. The imperial treasury was full, the empire was stable. Claudius, despite his health problems, showed no signs of immediate death. Messalina's position seemed absolutely secure. She'd survived for 7 years in a world that usually killed women like her within months. All she had to do was maintain the status quo, keep doing what she'd been doing, be patient, wait for Britannicus to grow up. In maybe 8 to 10 more years, when Britannicus reached adulthood, she'd have won. She'd have successfully guided her son to manhood and secured his position as emperor. But Messalina couldn't do it. She couldn't just sit still and wait. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was hubris. Maybe it was genuine emotion for the first time in her calculating life. Whatever the reason, in 48 CE, she met a man who would make her throw away everything she'd built. His name was Gaius Silius, and according to every single source we have, he was absolutely gorgeous. Tacitus calls him the handsomest man in Rome. Cassius Dio agrees, describing him as having surpassing beauty. Even Josephus, the Jewish historian who had no reason to care about Roman gossip, mentioned Silius's remarkable good looks. But he wasn't just pretty. He was also consul designate, meaning he'd been chosen for one of the highest offices in Rome. He was young, ambitious, wealthy, and politically connected. In other words, he was exactly the kind of man Messalina usually targeted for her blackmail network. Except this time, something was different. This time, if our sources are to be believed, Messalina actually fell in love. And that's when everything started to fall apart. Because a calculating political operator is dangerous but predictable. A woman in love? That's chaos. That's someone who'll risk everything for something as intangible as emotion. That's someone who might just burn down an empire because her heart tells her to. The relationship between Messalina and Silius is where our story shifts from political thriller to genuine tragedy. Because what happens next is so reckless, so incomprehensibly stupid, that historians have been arguing for 2,000 years about whether it actually happened the way the sources describe. Gaius Silius wasn't just handsome in a conventional way. Roman sources go absolutely wild trying to describe him. Tacitus uses the phrase praecipium formae, exceptional in beauty. Cassius Dio says he had surpassing physical attractiveness. But there's this one detail that Suetonius mentions that really paints the picture. Women would literally stop in the street to watch him walk by. Not noble women being discreet. All women, openly staring. That's the level of attractive we're talking about. He was also around 30 years old in 48 CE, which made him roughly the same age as Messalina. Remember, Claudius was in his 60s by this point. For the first time, Messalina was dealing with a man who was her contemporary, not someone old enough to be her grandfather. But here's what made Silius dangerous, and I mean genuinely dangerous, not just to Messalina's marriage but to her entire political machine. He was smart. According to Tacitus in Book 11 of the Annals, Silius came from a distinguished family. His father had been a consul and a close friend of Germanicus, which meant Silius had impeccable political connections. He'd just been designated consul for the year 48 CE, which meant he was on the fast track to the very top of Roman politics. In other words, he wasn't someone Messalina could easily manipulate or control. He had his own power base, his own wealth, his own ambitions. When she'd seduced senators before, they were terrified of her. Silius? The sources suggest he wasn't afraid at all. Tacitus tells us how it started. Messalina had Silius's wife, Junia Silana, divorced from him. Just straight up removed her from the picture. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't gradual. According to Tacitus, Messalina coveted Silius for his exceptional beauty and compelled him to divorce his wife. That's a direct quote. She saw him, wanted him, and used her imperial power to make him available. Now, you might think, okay, so it's like her other affairs. She seduces him, adds him to the list, moves on. But that's not what happened. Instead, Tacitus says something that should have been a massive red flag to everyone watching. Messalina gave herself up to this affair without concealment. Without concealment. Let me emphasize that. For 7 years, Messalina had been conducting her blackmail operations with calculation and discretion. Sure, rumours spread, but there was always plausible deniability. But with Silius, she stopped hiding it. She'd visit his house openly. He'd visit hers. They'd appear together at public events. Cassius Dio writes that she was with him constantly, giving him presents and honours. The entire city of Rome knew. And if Rome knew, then Claudius's freedmen knew. And if the freedmen knew, then Claudius probably knew, or at least suspected. So why didn't he do anything about it? This is where different historians have different theories, and honestly, they're all fascinating. Tacitus suggests that Claudius was just incredibly naive and easily manipulated. He quotes Messalina as telling Claudius that she was helping Silius with his consular duties, spending time with him to advise him on political matters. And supposedly, Claudius believed her, which, if true, means Claudius was either the most trusting husband in history or the most willfully blind. But Cassius Dio offers a different interpretation. He suggests that the freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, were deliberately not telling Claudius because they were waiting for Messalina to go too far, to make a mistake so egregious that they could finally get rid of her. Remember, these freedmen had been sharing power with Messalina for years, but they were also in constant competition with her. If she fell, they'd gain everything. There's a third theory, though, and this one comes from modern historians looking at the political context. What if Messalina and Silius were actually plotting something? What if this wasn't just an affair but the beginning of a coup? Here's the evidence for that reading. Silius wasn't just any senator. He was about to become consul, which meant he'd have significant official power. He had military connections through his father's legacy, and, this is crucial, he had the kind of traditional Roman credentials that Claudius lacked. Remember, half of Rome still saw Claudius as a joke, the stammering fool the Praetorians installed out of desperation. What if Messalina looked at her 60-year-old husband with his health problems and thought, when he dies, Britannicus will be 7 years old. Rome will never accept a child emperor. They'll install someone else, and my son will die. So what's her move? She finds a consul with the right bloodlines, the right connections, and the right ambitions. She elevates him, gives him imperial favour, and when Claudius dies, either naturally or not, she's already positioned her chosen successor. It's actually a brilliant strategy. Marry Britannicus's fate to a strong, capable man who owes everything to Messalina. Silius becomes regent, protects Britannicus until he comes of age, and Messalina continues to hold real power as the Empress mother. It's the same playbook that Agrippina the Younger would use successfully just a few years later with Nero. But there's a problem with this theory. It assumes Messalina was still thinking rationally, and every source we have suggests that by late 48 CE, rational thought had left the building. Tacitus gives us these incredibly vivid descriptions of Messalina's behaviour during this period. He says she would parade through Rome with Silius, as if he were her husband. She moved furniture and decorations from the imperial palace to Silius's house. She gave him imperial heirlooms, things that had belonged to Augustus to Tiberius. She was essentially transferring symbols of imperial power to her lover in full view of the entire city. And Silius, he was accepting them. According to Tacitus, he did not refuse these honours. Think about how insane that is. He was accepting items that were recognisable symbols of the emperor's authority. Every senator who saw them would know where they came from. This wasn't discretion. This was a public challenge to Claudius. Cassius Dio adds another detail that's absolutely wild. He claims that Messalina started referring to Silius as her husband in private conversations, and that Silius called her his wife. If true, that's not just adultery. In Roman law, that's claiming a marriage while the legal husband is still alive. It's bigamy. And for the emperor's wife to commit bigamy, that's not just scandal, that's treason. So here's the question that keeps historians awake at night. Was this a calculated political move that went wrong? Or was Messalina genuinely, recklessly in love for the first time in her life? The romantic reading is actually really compelling. Messalina had spent her entire adult life using people. Every relationship was transactional. Her marriage to Claudius was for survival. Her affairs were for blackmail. Her friendships were for political advantage. What if Silius was the first person she'd met who was her equal? Someone who wasn't afraid of her, who had his own power, who could match her intellectually and politically. Tacitus hints at this when he describes her behaviour. He uses words like reckless and abandoned, not in a sexual sense, but in the sense of abandoning caution. It's like watching someone who's been playing chess their whole life suddenly decide to flip the board because they found something more important than winning. There's this heartbreaking line from Cassius Dio where he describes Messalina as being enslaved by her passion for him. Enslaved. That's a powerful word choice, especially for a woman who'd spent years enslaving others through blackmail and fear. It suggests that for the first time, she wasn't in control. But the cynical reading is just as plausible. Maybe Messalina saw the writing on the wall. Maybe she knew that Claudius was dying, that the freedmen were turning against her, that her blackmail network was unsustainable. Maybe Silius was her exit strategy, a way to maintain power after Claudius died by having a capable adult male as the public face of authority while she pulled the strings. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. She was likely both in love and politically calculating, which made her behaviour even more erratic. Love made her reckless. Politics made her ambitious. Together, they created a toxic mixture that would lead to the most shocking event of her entire reign. Because here's what nobody expected, what even I find hard to believe despite reading multiple sources about it. In October of 48 CE, while Claudius was out of Rome visiting the port of Ostia, Messalina and Silius allegedly got married. Not secretly, not in some hidden ceremony. They had a full public official Roman wedding ceremony, complete with witnesses, a marriage contract and all the traditional rituals, while her legal husband, the Emperor of Rome, was still alive. When I first read this in Tacitus, I thought it had to be exaggerated. It's too insane, too self-destructive. But Tacitus is very specific about the details, and both Suetonius and Cassius Dio confirm the basic facts. They all describe the same event, a formal wedding ceremony between the Empress and the consul designate while the emperor was away. Tacitus actually stops his narrative to address the reader directly. He writes, "I am aware that it will seem fabulous that any human being should have shown such indifference in a city where nothing escapes notice or remains secret, and much more so that a consul designate and the emperor's wife should have met on a specified day, before witnesses, for the purpose of marriage. But I am not inventing marvels. What I am telling is the truth as narrated by my elders." In other words, Tacitus himself knows it sounds unbelievable. He's preemptively defending himself against accusations that he's making it up. And yet, he insists it happened. So what was Messalina thinking? Why would she do something so publicly, so irreversibly treasonous? There are really only three possible explanations. 1. It was a coup. She and Silius were making a move to overthrow Claudius, counting on the fact that Silius's consular authority, plus Messalina's control of the imperial household, plus their combined popularity with certain military units, would be enough to force Claudius out. The wedding was the public declaration that the old regime was over. 2. It was a religious ritual. Some historians think the wedding might have been part of a bacchanalian festival, or some other religious ceremony that got misinterpreted or exaggerated by hostile sources. The Romans had certain harvest festivals where people would engage in mock marriages as part of religious theatre. Maybe it was one of those, and the historians turned it into something more scandalous. 3. Messalina had completely lost touch with reality. 7 years of absolute power, of having everyone fear her, of being able to destroy anyone with a word. Maybe it broke something in her psychologically. Maybe she genuinely believed she could do anything, that the rules didn't apply to her, that she was untouchable. Personally, I think it was a combination of 1 and 3. I think she and Silius were attempting a coup, but they botched it so badly because Messalina's judgment had been compromised by a mixture of genuine emotion and years of unchecked power. And the freedmen? They'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The moment when Messalina would go so far that not even her most loyal supporters could defend her. The moment when Claudius would have no choice but to act. The wedding happened. The entire city knew about it within hours, and Narcissus, that clever former slave who'd helped Messalina eliminate so many rivals, finally saw his chance to eliminate her. According to Tacitus's detailed account in Book 11, Chapter 27 of his Annals, the wedding took place during the autumn harvest festival. And this wasn't some midnight elopement or secret ceremony. This was a full Roman wedding with all the traditional elements, performed in broad daylight, with witnesses from the highest ranks of Roman society. Let me walk you through what a traditional Roman wedding looked like, because understanding the ritual makes what Messalina did even more shocking. A proper Roman marriage ceremony had specific, legally required elements. First, the bride would be escorted from her father's house, or in this case the imperial palace, to the groom's house in a procession. There would be witnesses, typically important citizens who could testify that the marriage was legitimate. Then came the actual ceremony, which involved the couple joining hands while a priest performed the auspices, reading the omens to ensure the gods approved. After that, the bride would say, "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia." Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. It's basically ancient Roman for "I take you as my husband." The couple would then sign a marriage contract, the tabulae nuptiales, in front of witnesses. Finally, there'd be a feast with specific ritual foods, including a special cake called the panis farus, which the couple would share. Tacitus tells us that Messalina and Silius performed every single one of these rituals. Every single one. He writes, "The regular forms of marriage were gone through. They listened to the words of the diviners. They took their seats together. They offered sacrifice to the gods, and there was a banquet with guests reclining at table." Think about what this means. Messalina wasn't hiding anything. She wasn't claiming it was a joke or a theatrical performance. She was performing legally binding marriage rituals while her legal husband, the emperor, was 20 miles away inspecting grain shipments at Ostia. Suetonius, in his Life of Claudius, adds more details. He says the ceremony took place at Silius's house, which had been decorated with imperial purple and gold. The guests included the leading members of the state, senators, their wives, other officials. These weren't random partygoers. These were people whose presence at the ceremony made them witnesses to a legal marriage and the marriage contract. Tacitus says it was properly signed and sealed. In Roman law, a marriage contract witnessed by Roman citizens created a legal marriage, which meant that, legally speaking, Messalina had just committed bigamy. She was now simultaneously married to both the emperor and the consul designate. But here's the part that makes my head spin. Cassius Dio claims that Messalina actually transferred property to Silius as part of the marriage agreement. Real property, imperial estates, things that belonged to the emperor's household. She was giving away state property as a wedding gift to her new husband. It's like, imagine if the First Lady married someone else in a public ceremony at the Capitol building, signed legal documents making him her spouse, and then gave him the keys to Camp David. That's the level of brazen we're talking about. So the obvious question is, why did the guests attend? Why didn't someone say, Messalina, you're already married? Why did senators and their wives participate in something that was clearly treason? Tacitus gives us a chilling answer. He says the guests were there partly from fear, partly from incredulity. Fear, because saying no to Messalina's invitation meant potential execution, and incredulity, because surely this couldn't be what it looked like. Surely there was some explanation. Surely Messalina had gotten permission from Claudius. Surely this was some kind of religious ritual that looked like marriage, but wasn't actually marriage. That's the power of cognitive dissonance right there. The thing happening in front of your eyes is so impossible, so contrary to every rule of society, that your brain refuses to accept it. You convince yourself there must be some reasonable explanation, because the alternative, that the Empress has genuinely lost her mind and is committing public treason, is too terrifying to contemplate. Cassius Dio adds another layer to this. He suggests that some of the guests thought it was actually a good thing. They thought, finally someone is making a move against Claudius. Finally we might get a real emperor instead of this stammering fool. Remember, half of Rome still hated Claudius. They saw him as weak, as unqualified, as an embarrassment. Silius had everything Claudius lacked: youth, health, military bearing, the ability to speak without drooling. So maybe, just maybe, this wasn't treason. Maybe this was the beginning of a new regime, and if you were smart, you wanted to be on the winning side when the dust settled. But there's one detail that Tacitus mentions that suggests not everyone was on board with this plan. He says that during the ceremony there was an ominous silence from some of the guests. Not celebration, not cheering. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when people are witnessing something they know is going to end in blood. And it gets worse. According to Suetonius, the wedding feast turned into a full-blown bacchanalia, a wine-fueled orgy dedicated to Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy. These festivals were technically illegal in Rome because they'd been banned by the Senate back in 186 BCE for getting too out of control. But Messalina apparently decided that if you're going to commit treason, you might as well go all in. Tacitus describes what happened. The day was spent in riotous enjoyment. Messalina was dancing among the Bacchae, crowned with ivy and dressed in the costume of the Mysteries. Silius was dressed as Bacchus himself. There was singing, shouting, and wanton behaviour before the eyes of all. Ivy crowns and Bacchus costumes. Do you know what that symbolises in Roman religion? It's the complete abandonment of social order. Bacchus was the god who broke down barriers, who made slaves equal to masters, who turned the world upside down. Messalina wasn't just getting married, she was performing a ritual that represented the overthrow of everything Rome stood for. Now you might think that someone would have sent word to Claudius immediately, that the moment the ceremony started, a loyal servant would have jumped on a horse and ridden to Ostia screaming, "Your wife just married someone else." But that's not what happened. According to Tacitus, the freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas and Callistus, deliberately prevented anyone from telling Claudius. They wanted the wedding to happen. They wanted it to be as public, as witnessed, as legally documented as possible, because they were building a case. After 7 years of Messalina's reign of terror, they finally had something so egregious, so undeniable, that even Claudius couldn't overlook it. Think about the calculation here. If someone had warned Claudius early, Messalina might have been able to explain it away. "Oh, it was just a theatrical performance, darling. You know how I love drama." But if they let her go through the entire ceremony, sign the contracts, consummate the marriage, and throw a massive party celebrating it, then there was no explanation that would work. Narcissus was playing the long game, and Messalina, for all her political genius over the past 7 years, had finally walked right into the trap. But here's what's really interesting. The sources disagree about whether Messalina knew what she was doing. Tacitus suggests she'd been seized by a strange infatuation and had lost touch with reality. Cassius Dio thinks she was attempting a calculated political coup, but miscalculated how much support she actually had. Suetonius implies she thought Claudius would die soon anyway, so she was preemptively arranging the succession. Modern historians have offered another interpretation that's fascinating. What if Messalina genuinely believed that in Roman law, you could divorce your husband without his consent if you married someone else? There was actually some legal ambiguity here. Women couldn't technically initiate divorce in Roman law, but if a woman married another man, was the first marriage automatically void? It's a legal grey area that Messalina, who'd spent years manipulating Roman law to her advantage, might have thought she could exploit. Maybe she believed that by publicly marrying Silius with proper witnesses and contracts, she was creating a legal situation that Claudius would have to accept, because the alternative would be to admit his wife had cuckolded him in front of the entire Senate. If that was her calculation, she badly misread the room. Because what might work for a private citizen doesn't work for the emperor's wife. The stakes were too high, the humiliation was too public, and the political implications were too dangerous. Think about it from the perspective of average Romans hearing this news. The emperor's wife has publicly married someone else. Does that mean Silius is emperor now? Does that mean there's going to be a civil war? Should they stockpile food? Arm themselves? The uncertainty alone was destabilizing the city. Cassius Dio tells us that as news of the wedding spread through Rome, there was genuine panic. People started barricading their homes. Some fled the city entirely. Because Roman history had shown them what happened when there was a power struggle at the top. The streets ran with blood. And standing in Ostia, completely unaware that his wife had just committed the most public act of treason in Roman history, was Claudius, the man who'd survived decades of imperial politics by being underestimated, the man who everyone thought was a fool, the man who was about to face a choice that would define the rest of his reign. Because when Narcissus finally told him what had happened, and we'll get to that conversation in a moment, Claudius would have to decide, was he going to be the weak, cuckolded emperor that everyone expected? Or was he going to show Rome that the stammering fool had teeth after all? The answer would determine whether Messalina lived to see another sunrise, and whether her children would survive the fallout of their mother's spectacular self-destruction. Narcissus knew he had one shot at this. One opportunity to turn Claudius against the woman who'd shared his bed for 9 years, who'd given him 2 children, who'd helped him survive as emperor. If he miscalculated, if Messalina got to Claudius first, Narcissus would be dead by sunset. And probably not quickly. So he did something absolutely brilliant. According to Tacitus in Book 11, Chapter 29, Narcissus didn't tell Claudius himself. Not at first. Instead, he gathered 2 of Claudius's mistresses. Yes, the emperor had mistresses, which gives you some idea of what his marriage was actually like. And he told them to break the news. Their names were Calpurnia and Cleopatra, not the famous Egyptian Cleopatra. That was a common name among freedwomen. These were former slaves who'd become Claudius's lovers, and according to Tacitus they had significant influence over him. Narcissus understood something crucial about Claudius. He trusted women he was sleeping with more than he trusted his political advisors. It's a weird dynamic, but there it is. Tacitus writes that Narcissus prompted Calpurnia and Cleopatra to warn the emperor that Messalina had married Silius. He coached them on exactly what to say. He probably rehearsed it with them multiple times, because the way you deliver this kind of news determines whether the listener believes it or dismisses it as slander. So picture the scene. Claudius is at his villa in Ostia, probably having dinner, completely relaxed. He's had a successful day inspecting the grain supplies, making sure Rome's food supply is secure. He's feeling pretty good about himself. Then Calpurnia and Cleopatra approach him, and according to Tacitus, Calpurnia speaks first. "Caesar," she says, "are you aware that Messalina is married?" Just like that. Direct. No preamble. No softening the blow. And the word she uses, according to Tacitus's Latin, is nupta, which specifically means legally married, not just having an affair. Claudius apparently laughed. Of course he did. It was absurd. His wife was in Rome, probably shopping or visiting friends or whatever empresses did. She couldn't be married to someone else. He was right there. He was her husband. The whole thing was ridiculous. But then Cleopatra adds, "And she's been married in the traditional form before witnesses with all the proper ceremonies." That made Claudius pause, because if this was just a rumour about an affair, why would anyone make up such elaborate details about a formal ceremony? Suetonius, in his Life of Claudius, says that Claudius's first reaction was anger at Calpurnia and Cleopatra for spreading obvious lies. He apparently told them to stop making things up and leave him alone. This is where Narcissus made his entrance. He'd been waiting just outside, listening. The moment he heard Claudius getting angry at the messengers instead of the message, he knew he had to intervene. He came in with a stack of documents, the marriage contract that Messalina and Silius had signed, witnessed and sealed. Tacitus describes what happened next. Narcissus then produced the signatories to the marriage, who confirmed that they had been present at the ceremony. These weren't random slaves. These were Roman citizens, some of them senators, whose legal testimony carried weight. And they were all confirming the same story. Yes, they witnessed a formal marriage ceremony between Messalina and Silius. Yes, it included all the traditional elements. Yes, the contract was signed and sealed according to Roman law. Claudius went pale. Suetonius tells us he started stammering worse than usual, which was saying something, and his hands began to shake. Not from his usual tremors, but from shock, because the evidence was right there in front of him. Legal documents with real signatures from real witnesses. But here's where Narcissus showed his true genius. He didn't let Claudius spiral into shock or denial. Instead, according to Tacitus, he immediately shifted to fear. He said something like, "Caesar, don't you understand what this means? Messalina hasn't just betrayed you personally. She's attempting a coup. Silius is consul designate. If he can claim he's married to the Empress, he can claim legitimacy for taking the throne. Your life is in danger." That's when Claudius finally got it. This wasn't just about adultery or humiliation. This was about survival. Messalina and Silius weren't just having an affair. They were positioning themselves to overthrow him. Cassius Dio adds a detail that Tacitus doesn't include. He says that Narcissus told Claudius, "Silius already occupies your house, your bed, and commands your household slaves. He has everything except the title of emperor, and he's working on getting that too." Whether that was true or exaggerated doesn't matter. What matters is that Claudius believed it, and once he believed his life was in danger, Narcissus had him. But Narcissus knew something else. Messalina was persuasive, incredibly persuasive. If she got face to face with Claudius, if she could cry and plead and blame everything on Silius, if she could use their children as leverage, she might talk her way out of this. She'd survived every crisis for 9 years by knowing exactly what to say to Claudius. So Narcissus made a decision that was either brilliantly strategic or absolutely treasonous, depending on how you look at it. According to Tacitus, Narcissus took command of the Praetorian Guard, declaring that there was a conspiracy against the emperor. Read that again. A freedman, a former slave, took command of the emperor's personal bodyguard without asking permission. He just declared himself in charge and ordered the Praetorians to escort Claudius back to Rome immediately. And the Praetorians, probably confused but recognizing that someone needed to be in charge, followed his orders. This is unprecedented. There's no other example in Roman history of a freedman commanding the Praetorian Guard. But Narcissus understood that in a crisis, people follow whoever acts most confident. So he acted like he had authority, and everyone assumed he must have it. The journey back to Rome became a race. Messalina had gotten word that Claudius knew about the wedding. Different sources disagree on how she found out. Maybe one of the guests at the wedding sent a warning, maybe servants in Ostia got word to her, but she knew. And she knew her only chance was to reach Claudius before Narcissus could completely turn him against her. Tacitus gives us this incredibly dramatic description. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus. Remember those gardens she'd stolen from Valerius Asiaticus, while her mother Domitia Lepida urged her to face death with dignity. Wait, her mother told her to commit suicide? That's brutal even by Roman standards. But Domitia Lepida was apparently a pragmatist. According to Cassius Dio, she'd been estranged from Messalina for years. Some sources suggest Messalina had threatened her mother's property and influence. So when Domitia Lepida saw that her daughter was doomed, she essentially said, "Die with some dignity instead of begging." But Messalina refused. She was 27 years old. She had 2 young children. She'd been Empress for 9 years. She wasn't ready to give up, so she made one final desperate play. She grabbed Britannicus and Octavia, her 7-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter, and set out to intercept Claudius on his way back from Ostia. The plan was simple: make Claudius see his children, remind him that they were a family, appeal to his emotions before Narcissus could poison his mind further. Tacitus describes this moment with surprising sympathy. He writes, "Messalina took her 2 children with her and prepared to meet Claudius on the road, so that she might appeal to him as the father of their children." Can you imagine this scene? The Empress of Rome, probably dressed simply to appear humble and sympathetic, holding the hands of 2 terrified children who have no idea what's happening, waiting by the roadside for her husband's convoy to appear. It's almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. Meanwhile, on that same road, Claudius was in his carriage with Narcissus. And Narcissus knew that if Claudius saw those children, if Messalina got a chance to speak, everything could still fall apart. So according to Tacitus, Narcissus did something absolutely ruthless. He distracted Claudius. Every time they approached a spot where Messalina might be waiting, Narcissus would point out something else. "Look, Caesar, there's damage to that bridge. We should note it for repairs." Or, "See those troops? They look undisciplined. We should speak with their commander." He kept Claudius's attention diverted, looking anywhere except at the road ahead. But more importantly, he kept talking. According to Suetonius, Narcissus spent the entire journey recounting every crime, every murder, every piece of blackmail that Messalina had committed over the past 9 years. He painted a picture of a woman who was not just unfaithful but dangerous, not just scandalous, but actively treasonous. And Claudius, trapped in a carriage with no one to contradict Narcissus's version of events, started to believe it all. The stammering fool was finally seeing his wife clearly for the first time. Messalina did manage to get close at one point. Tacitus tells us that she appeared on the road with Britannicus and Octavia, and she started to call out to Claudius. But before she could say more than a few words, Narcissus shouted over her, "Don't listen to the adulteress. Look at these witnesses instead." And he thrust forward the signed marriage contract and the senators who'd witnessed the ceremony. Legal proof versus emotional appeal. And in that moment, legal proof won. Cassius Dio adds a heartbreaking detail. He says that little Britannicus reached out toward his father's carriage crying. The 7-year-old boy had no idea why his mother was upset or why his father wouldn't stop. He just knew something was terribly wrong and he wanted his father to fix it. But Claudius, whether from Narcissus's manipulation or genuine shock or fear for his life, ordered the driver to keep going. They passed Messalina and the children without stopping. Think about what that must have felt like for Messalina. She'd controlled Rome for 9 years. She'd destroyed dozens of people with a word. She'd accumulated wealth and power beyond imagination. And now she couldn't even get her own husband to stop his carriage and listen to her. Tacitus writes, Messalina's strength finally failed her. After 9 years of being the most powerful woman in the world, reality finally crashed down on her. The game was over, and she'd lost. She returned to the gardens of Lucullus, those beautiful gardens that she'd killed to possess, and according to Tacitus, she tried to write a petition of mercy to Claudius, but her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the pen. A woman who'd signed dozens of death warrants couldn't even sign her own plea for life. The convoy continued to Rome, and Narcissus, sitting next to Claudius, knowing he'd won but also knowing that Claudius was unpredictable, made sure of one final thing. He kept Claudius drinking. Tacitus explicitly mentions this. Narcissus plied the emperor with wine during the journey. Why? Because a drunk Claudius was easier to control. A drunk Claudius wouldn't suddenly decide to forgive his wife. A drunk Claudius could be guided to make the decision that Narcissus needed him to make. By the time they reached Rome, according to Suetonius, Claudius was asking where his poor Messalina was and whether he should see her. The man was drunk, confused, and apparently feeling guilty. Even after everything, even after the evidence, some part of him still loved his wife, or at least pitied her. Narcissus couldn't let that happen. If Claudius saw Messalina, if they spoke, if she cried and begged and reminded him of their 9 years together, of their children, of everything they'd built, it might work. She might survive. And if she survived, Narcissus would die. So Narcissus made the most consequential decision of his life, a decision that would save his own life but damn him in history, a decision that would rob Messalina of even the basic right to defend herself before her judge. What Narcissus did next technically wasn't legal. Actually, it was completely illegal. But in that moment, with Claudius drunk and confused, with Rome on the edge of chaos, with his own life on the line, Narcissus decided that legality was less important than finality. According to Tacitus in Book 11, Chapter 37, Narcissus gave an order to the tribune of the Praetorian Guard: execute Messalina, not arrest her and bring her to trial, not place her under house arrest pending the emperor's decision, just execute her, immediately. Tacitus is very clear about this. Narcissus ordered the tribune and centurions to carry out the execution. He gave this command in Claudius's name, but without actually asking Claudius for permission. Think about the audacity of that. A former slave, ordering the death of the Empress, claiming imperial authority he didn't technically possess. But here's the twisted brilliance of it. If anyone challenged him, if the tribune said, "Wait, I need to hear this from the emperor himself," Narcissus could just wake up Claudius and get confirmation, and Claudius, drunk and angry and scared, would probably give it. So the tribune didn't question the order, he just followed it. This is one of those moments in history where everything hinges on a split-second decision. If the tribune had insisted on checking with Claudius first, if he delayed even an hour, Messalina might have found a way to survive. She might have gotten a message to supporters, might have fled Rome, might have done something. But Narcissus gave her no time, no chance, no hope. Meanwhile, in the gardens of Lucullus, Messalina was having a complete breakdown. Suetonius tells us she couldn't decide whether to fight or surrender, whether to run or stay, whether to kill herself or beg for mercy. For 9 years she'd always known what to do. She'd always had a plan, an angle, a way out. Now, nothing worked. Her mind was paralyzed, and standing there with her was the last person she probably wanted to see, her mother, Domitia Lepida. The relationship between Messalina and her mother is one of the most fascinating subplots in this entire story. Tacitus mentions that they'd been estranged for years. He writes, Domitia Lepida, who during her daughter's prosperity had not shown her a mother's affection, was now moved by her extremity to pity. That line tells you everything. When Messalina was powerful, when she was Empress, when she could have used her mother's support and guidance, Domitia Lepida kept her distance. Maybe she was afraid of her daughter. Maybe she resented her daughter's power. Maybe they'd had some personal conflict we don't know about, but they weren't close. Yet now, seeing her daughter completely destroyed, facing certain death, Domitia Lepida came to her, not to save her, not to offer escape plans or political maneuvering, but to help her die with dignity. Cassius Dio gives us more details about this interaction, and honestly it's heartbreaking. He says Domitia Lepida told Messalina, "Your life is over. The only question now is whether you die well or badly. Die like a Roman. Die like a Roman meant suicide. Clean, dignified, self-inflicted death rather than being executed like a common criminal. For Roman aristocrats, particularly women, suicide was considered the honourable choice when facing disgrace. You took control of your own end rather than giving your enemies the satisfaction of killing you. Messalina apparently tried. According to Tacitus, she picked up a dagger and held it to her throat. But she couldn't do it. Her hands were shaking. Her courage failed. Tacitus writes, "Her cowardly spirit could neither embrace life nor relinquish it." I want to pause here because I think cowardly is unfair. This woman was 27 years old. She had 2 young children. Whatever crime she'd committed, whatever ruthless things she'd done, in that moment she was just a scared person who didn't want to die. That's not cowardice. That's human. But Roman historians didn't see it that way. To them, a noble Roman woman should be able to kill herself when honour demanded it. There were famous examples: Lucretia, who stabbed herself after being raped; Portia, who killed herself when her husband Brutus died; Arria, who stabbed herself to show her husband how to die bravely. These were held up as models of feminine virtue. Messalina couldn't live up to that standard, and in the eyes of Roman historians that made her failure complete. She couldn't even die properly, so she just stood there, in those beautiful gardens, with a knife in her hand and her mother watching, frozen by fear and indecision. And that's when the soldiers arrived. Tacitus gives us the names. The tribune was accompanied by Evadus, a freedman of the emperor. The tribune represented official military authority. Evadus represented Narcissus's personal oversight. He was there to make sure the order was actually carried out and not somehow sabotaged. They found Messalina sitting by a garden fountain with Domitia Lepida standing over her. According to Cassius Dio, Messalina was crying. Not dignified tears, but full-body sobbing. The woman who'd terrorized senators, who'd ordered dozens of executions, who'd faced down political enemies without flinching, was crying like a child. The tribune delivered his message. The emperor has ordered your death. Note that phrasing. The emperor has ordered, not Narcissus has ordered. The tribune believed he was carrying out Claudius's direct command, even though Claudius probably didn't even know the order had been given yet. Messalina apparently tried to speak, to plead, to offer some defense, but Tacitus says Evadus interrupted her with reproaches. Every time she started to talk, he would cut her off, listing her crimes, reminding her of the people she'd killed, the marriages she'd destroyed, the lives she'd ruined. It's cruel, but it's also strategic, because if Messalina got a chance to make her case, if she could speak eloquently about being a mother, about how she'd been misled by Silius, about how she'd only ever tried to protect her children, the soldiers might hesitate. They might decide to take her back to Claudius for a proper hearing. Evadus couldn't let that happen. Domitia Lepida, watching this, finally intervened. According to Tacitus, she urged her daughter one final time, take the steel yourself rather than wait for the executioner's hand. Think about that moment. A mother telling her daughter to kill herself, not out of cruelty, but out of a twisted kind of love. Because in Roman culture, how you died mattered. It affected your family's reputation, your children's future, your place in history. A self-inflicted death was noble. An execution was shameful. But Messalina still couldn't do it. She held the dagger. She brought it close to her throat, but she couldn't push it in. Tacitus writes that she made futile attempts but couldn't complete the act. Her survival instinct was too strong, or her fear was too great, or maybe some part of her still hoped for a miracle. so the tribune made the decision for her. According to Tacitus, the tribune drove the sword through her body, just like that. One thrust, through the chest or abdomen. The sources don't specify. Messalina, who'd been Empress of Rome for 9 years, who'd controlled the most powerful empire in the world, who destroyed countless lives with a word, died in a garden on the orders of a freedman, executed by a soldier who probably didn't even know her personally. She was 27 years old. Her daughter Octavia was 9. Her son Britannicus was 7. Cassius Dio adds one more detail that absolutely crushes me. He says that in her final moments Messalina reached out toward the direction of the palace, toward where her children were. Her last gesture was toward her kids. Whether she was thinking about protecting them, or apologizing to them, or just desperate for some connection to something pure in her life, we'll never know. But that image, a dying mother reaching toward her children, is the most human moment in this entire saga. The execution happened so fast that by the time Claudius finished his dinner back at the palace, Messalina was already dead. Suetonius tells us what happened next, and it's almost darkly comic in its absurdity. Claudius was at dinner with various officials and friends. He was still drunk from the wine Narcissus had been feeding him all day, and according to Suetonius, when Claudius asked why the Empress did not come to dinner, no one dared to tell him she was dead. Can you imagine that scene? The Emperor, drunk and confused, asking about his wife, and everyone at the table knowing she'd been executed an hour ago, but nobody willing to tell him. They just sat there in awkward silence until someone changed the subject. It wasn't until the next morning, that Narcissus officially informed Claudius that Messalina had been executed. And Claudius's reaction, according to Suetonius, he showed no emotion. He neither rejoiced nor grieved. He simply asked for more wine. That's it. 9 years of marriage, 2 children, countless political entanglements, and when told his wife was dead, Claudius just asked for another drink. Whether that was shock, relief, suppressed grief, or genuine indifference, we'll never know. But Tacitus adds one detail that suggests maybe Claudius felt something after all. He never mentioned her name again. For the rest of his life, another 6 years as emperor, Claudius never spoke about Messalina. It was as if she'd never existed. Within days, possibly even hours, Messalina's body was buried. There was no state funeral, no public mourning, no monuments, just a quiet burial somewhere outside Rome. The sources don't even tell us where. And then came the damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of memory. This was a Roman legal process where the Senate voted to erase someone from history. Every statue of Messalina was torn down or had its face chiseled off. Every inscription with her name was destroyed. Every official document was edited to remove her. Cassius Dio describes it. All her images were demolished, and her name was erased from all inscriptions, both public and private. They even went through private homes, forcing families to destroy any artwork or mention of her. It was systematic cultural erasure. The empire was trying to pretend she'd never existed, and it almost worked. If not for historians like Tacitus writing decades later, we might not know anything about her at all. But the cruelest part of the damnatio memoriae was what it meant for her children. Britannicus and Octavia couldn't mourn their mother publicly. They couldn't speak about her. They couldn't even acknowledge she'd existed. Imagine being 9 years old, your mother has just been violently killed, and you're not allowed to cry or grieve or even say her name. Tacitus mentions that Britannicus, at 7 years old, watched all of this happen and understood what it meant. The boy who'd been the centre of all Messalina's plotting, The heir she'd killed to protect now had to watch his mother be erased from existence, and the absolute tragic irony. All of Messalina's murders, all her blackmail, all her ruthless protection of Britannicus's succession, it was for nothing. Because within a year, Claudius married again, and his new wife, Agrippina the Younger, Messalina's old rival, the one Messalina had tried multiple times to kill, and Agrippina brought her son Nero with her, the same Nero that Messalina had seen as a threat to Britannicus. Within 5 years, Agrippina would poison Claudius and put Nero on the throne, and one of Nero's first acts as emperor would be to have Britannicus poisoned at a family dinner. He was just 13 years old. Every single thing Messalina had done to protect her son failed. He died anyway, killed by the very people she'd tried to eliminate years earlier. So what are we supposed to make of Messalina's story? Was she a monster, a victim, a mother driven to extremes, a ruthless politician who happened to be female in a world that only allowed women power through manipulation? The answer is probably all of the above. She was complicated, flawed, brilliant, terrifying, human. She made calculated political murders and possibly fell genuinely in love. She protected her children through violence and ultimately failed to save them. She was both the author of her own destruction and a product of an impossible system. What haunts me most is those final moments. A scared woman in a garden, unable to kill herself, reaching toward where her children slept, cut down by a soldier on orders from a freedman. That's how the story of Rome's most powerful empress ended. Not in glory, not in battle, not even in a proper trial, just a quick death in a stolen garden, followed by systematic erasure. But here's the thing about trying to erase someone from history. It doesn't work. Not completely. Because 2,000 years later, we're still talking about Messalina, still debating her legacy, still trying to understand who she really was beneath the propaganda and scandal. The irony is that by trying so hard to make everyone forget her, Rome actually ensured we'd remember. Because the very extremity of the condemnation tells us she was important. She was powerful. She was dangerous. You don't erase nobodies from history. You only erase people who matter. Within 48 hours of Messalina's death, Rome began to forget her. Not naturally, not gradually, but by official decree, the Senate convened in emergency session and passed a formal damnatio memoriae, literally condemnation of memory, against her. And when I say they tried to erase her, I mean they went after every single trace of her existence, with a thoroughness that would impress even modern authoritarian regimes. Let me show you how complete this erasure was. In 2008, archaeologists working at a site in Ephesus discovered something fascinating. They found a marble inscription from 48 CE, the exact year of Messalina's death, that had originally listed the Imperial family. You could still see the carved names, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus for Claudius, and spaces for other family members. But one name had been systematically chiselled out. The marble was gouged so deeply that you couldn't even make out individual letters anymore. Just a blank gap where a name used to be. That gap, that was Messalina. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Hilke Thür from the Austrian Archaeological Institute, noted in her published findings that this pattern repeated across the empire. Wherever Messalina's name had been inscribed in stone, it was removed. Not painted over, not covered, physically destroyed. Because in Roman belief, names had power. If your name existed, you existed. Erase the name, erase the person. But it wasn't just inscriptions. According to Cassius Dio in his Roman History, Book 60, the Senate ordered all her images to be melted down or demolished, and her name to be erased from all records. Think about what that means. Every statue in every city, every coin bearing her image, every official document that mentioned her, every temple dedication, every public monument, gone, and people actually did it. In 2019, researchers at the British Museum analysed a collection of coins from Claudius's reign. They found dozens of coins that had originally featured Messalina's profile alongside Claudius. But the coins had been deliberately defaced. Someone had taken a hammer and chisel and systematically destroyed Messalina's face on every single coin, while leaving Claudius intact. That's not random vandalism, that's organised empire-wide erasure. There's a statue in the Vatican museums that perfectly illustrates this. It's from the mid-1st century CE, shows a woman in imperial dress, has inscriptions identifying it as from Claudius's reign. But the head? It's a replacement. Someone in antiquity cut off the original head and carved a new one. Most scholars believe the original head was Messalina's, removed after her damnatio memoriae, and replaced with either a generic female face or possibly Agrippina the Younger. Because here's where it gets really interesting. The person who benefited most from Messalina's erasure was the woman who took her place. Agrippina the Younger, the same woman Messalina had tried to kill, the same rival she'd seen as a threat to Britannicus, became Claudius's fourth wife less than a year after Messalina's death. And Agrippina didn't just become empress. She became the chief architect of how history would remember her predecessor. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, had access to sources written during Agrippina's time as empress. And he notes something crucial in Book 12 of his Annals. He writes that after Agrippina married Claudius, there was a complete transformation in the state. Everything was under a woman's control, but a woman who did not, like Messalina, toy with Roman affairs in a spirit of wantonness. You see what Tacitus is doing there? He's contrasting the two empresses. Agrippina is presented as serious, political, calculating. Messalina is presented as frivolous, sexual, chaotic. It's a comparison that makes Agrippina look better by making Messalina look worse. And Agrippina had both the means and the motive to shape this narrative. She controlled access to Claudius during his final years. She influenced which records were kept and which were destroyed. She decided what stories were told and what stories were suppressed. According to Suetonius in his Life of Nero, Agrippina even commissioned official histories that portrayed her favourably, and her rivals, including Messalina, as threats to imperial stability. This is what historians call victor's history. The people who win get to write the story, and they write it in ways that justify their victory and demonize their opponents. Messalina couldn't defend herself because she was dead. She couldn't contradict the stories because she'd been erased, so the narrative that survived was the one that served Agrippina's interests. But here's what's fascinating. We can actually trace how the stories about Messalina got more extreme over time. The sources written closest to her death are relatively restrained. Then, as decades pass and new dynasties take power, the stories get wilder, more scandalous, more sexualized. Let me show you what I mean. Seneca the Younger, writing in the 50s CE, just a few years after Messalina's death, mentions her briefly in his Apocolocyntosis, a satire about Claudius's death. He refers to her adultery and mentions a few lovers, but he doesn't say anything about brothels or competitions with prostitutes. He presents her as politically dangerous, not sexually deviant. Then we get to Pliny the Elder in the 70s CE, about 30 years after her death. That's when we first hear about the Scylla competition and the 25 men in one night. Where did Pliny get this story? He claims it comes from recorded events, but he doesn't cite his source, and no earlier writer mentions it. By the time we get to Juvenal in the early 2nd century, 60 years after Messalina's death, the stories have exploded. Now she's sneaking out to brothels in disguise, working under a false name, competing with professional prostitutes. Juvenal writes in his Satire 6 that she would take her position in a brothel, in a cell with a gilt nameplate, and display herself naked with gilded nipples. Gilded nipples? Where did that detail come from? Not from any contemporary source. Juvenal is writing satire, not history, but later readers took him literally, and the stories kept growing. Fast forward to the medieval period, and European writers are using Messalina as the ultimate symbol of female lust. Dante mentions her in the Inferno. Medieval morality plays feature her as a cautionary tale. By the Renaissance, artists are painting her in increasingly pornographic scenarios that have zero historical basis, but sell well because sex sells. Each generation added to the legend because outrage and scandal are memorable. Boring political competence isn't. So the Empress who ran a blackmail network and systematically eliminated rivals got forgotten. The Empress who allegedly had sex with 25 men in one night became immortal. This is what scholars call historical slut-shaming, the tendency to reduce complex, powerful women to their sexual behaviour, real or imagined. And it's not unique to Messalina. Look at how many powerful women in history get remembered primarily for their sex lives, rather than their political achievements. Cleopatra. We remember her romances with Caesar and Antony more than her diplomatic genius or her economic reforms. Marie Antoinette. We remember "let them eat cake," which she never said, and rumours about her sex life more than her actual political role. Catherine the Great. The fake horse story overshadows her modernisation of Russia. There's a pattern here, and it's been repeating for thousands of years. When women gain power in patriarchal societies, the easiest way to undermine them is to attack their sexual morality. Because in most cultures, a woman's value has historically been tied to her sexual purity. Destroy that, and you destroy her credibility. Modern historian Dr. Sandra Joschel from the University of Washington wrote a brilliant analysis of this in her 1997 paper, Female Desire and the Discourse of Empire. She argues that the Messalina legend tells us more about Roman anxieties about female power than it does about Messalina herself. The Romans couldn't accept that a woman could wield political power effectively, so they reframed her political maneuvering as sexual deviance, and that reframing was so successful that it's still working today. When people think of Messalina, they think of sex scandals. They don't think about her political alliance with the freedmen. They don't think about her systematic elimination of threats to her son. They don't think about how she navigated one of the most dangerous political environments in history and survived for 9 years. But maybe the most tragic part of the Damnatio Memoriae wasn't what it did to Messalina's reputation. It was what it did to her children. Britannicus was 7 years old when his mother was executed and erased from official memory. Tacitus tells us in Book 12 that the boy became withdrawn and silent. He couldn't speak about his mother. He couldn't ask questions about what happened. He couldn't even grieve publicly. And then, just a year later, he watched his father marry Agrippina, the woman his mother had identified as their greatest enemy. He watched Agrippina bring her son Nero into the palace. He watched as Claudius adopted Nero, making him co-heir with Britannicus despite being 3 years older. According to Tacitus, Britannicus understood exactly what was happening. At 8 years old, he knew his succession was being stolen. He knew Agrippina was positioning Nero to replace him. He knew he was in danger, and he could do absolutely nothing about it. Cassius Dio records that Britannicus would sometimes cry for his mother when he thought no one was watching. A child, mourning the parent he couldn't acknowledge, knowing that the people who killed her were now raising him. In 55 CE, When Britannicus was 13 years old, he died suddenly during a family dinner. The official cause was epilepsy, but Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and basically every ancient historian who mentions it says the same thing. Nero poisoned him. Agrippina's son murdered Messalina's son, eliminating the last obstacle to the throne. Everything Messalina had done, every murder, every manipulation, every ruthless political calculation, had been to protect Britannicus and secure his succession. And in the end, he died anyway, poisoned by the son of the woman Messalina had failed to eliminate. The irony is almost too perfect to bear. Octavia, Messalina's daughter, somehow survived, but her life was arguably worse than her brother's death. At 14, she was married to Nero, her adopted brother, the son of her mother's enemy, her actual brother's murderer. According to Tacitus in Book 14, it was a marriage of pure political convenience. Nero didn't love her, he barely tolerated her. Within a few years, Nero divorced Octavia to marry his mistress Poppaea Sabina, and when Octavia refused to go quietly, when she tried to maintain her dignity, Nero had her executed. According to Suetonius, she was exiled to an island, then killed on false charges of adultery, the exact same fate as her mother. Messalina's daughter, murdered at 22, accused of the same crime that had destroyed her mother. The cycle completed itself with horrifying symmetry. So the erasure of Messalina wasn't just about removing statues and chiseling out names, it was about eliminating an entire family line. Within 7 years of Messalina's death, both of her children were dead. No grandchildren, no descendants. The bloodline that she'd fought so hard to protect was completely extinguished. And yet, somehow, Messalina survived. Not physically, not genealogically, but culturally. Because you can destroy every statue and erase every name, but you can't kill a story. And Messalina's story was too dramatic, too scandalous, too useful as propaganda for it to die. The Romans tried to make everyone forget her. Instead, they made her immortal, because the very extremity of the damnatio memoriae drew attention to her. The very violence of the erasure suggested that she'd been important, powerful, dangerous. You don't try this hard to forget someone unless they mattered. So here we are, 2,000 years later, still talking about her, still trying to figure out who she really was, still debating whether she was a monster or a victim, a calculating politician or a woman driven mad by power, a protective mother or a ruthless killer. The answer, as with most historical figures, is probably all of the above. But what strikes me most about Messalina's story isn't her crimes or her scandals. It's how easily her actual life got buried beneath layers of propaganda, how quickly a complicated human being got reduced to a one-dimensional caricature, and how that caricature has defined her for millennia, which makes me wonder, how many other historical figures have we completely misunderstood because the victors wrote the history? How many people have been simplified, demonized, or erased because it serves someone's political interests? How many Messalinas are out there, buried beneath centuries of propaganda, waiting for someone to dig deeper and ask better questions? Because at the end of the day, history isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets to tell the story. And in Messalina's case, the people telling the story were her enemies, writing decades after her death, under different rulers with different agendas. They created a legend that eclipsed the truth so completely that we'll probably never recover it. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the lesson here isn't about Messalina at all. Maybe it's about how we think about powerful women in general, how we judge them, how we remember them, and how easily sexual scandal can be weaponized to destroy someone's legacy completely. So after all of this, after 13 parts exploring murders, political intrigue, sexual scandal and systematic erasure, we're left with one fundamental question. Why does any of this matter? Why should we care about a woman who died 2,000 years ago, whose crimes were real, whose scandals were probably exaggerated, and whose entire existence was professionally erased? I've been thinking about this a lot while researching Messalina's story, and I think the answer is both simpler and more complicated than you'd expect. Let me start with something that historian Mary Beard from Cambridge University wrote in her 2017 book Women and Power: A Manifesto. She makes this observation that stopped me in my tracks. We have no template for what a powerful woman looks like, except that she looks rather like a man. Think about that in the context of Messalina. She was operating in a world where women legally couldn't hold power. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't command armies, couldn't officially participate in government. The only power available to Roman women came through their relationships to powerful men, as mothers, wives, daughters, or lovers. So what did Messalina do? She weaponized the only tools the patriarchy gave her. Sex became political leverage. Motherhood became justification for murder. Marriage became a pathway to influence. She took the limited options available and maximized them to their absolute extreme. And Rome's response? They couldn't accept that a woman could be politically brilliant, so they reframed her genius as sexual deviance. They couldn't admit that she'd outmaneuvered senators and generals, so they reduced her to a caricature of uncontrollable lust. They couldn't process a woman wielding real power, so they made her into a monster, specifically a sexual monster, because that's the kind of female monster that patriarchal societies understand. Dr. Josiah Osgood from Georgetown University published a fascinating paper in 2011 titled Claudius Caesar: Image and Power in the Early Roman Empire. In it, he argues that the Messalina scandal served a specific political purpose. By portraying Messalina as sexually out of control, Roman writers could avoid confronting the uncomfortable reality that she had been politically competent and effectively sharing imperial power with Claudius for nearly a decade. In other words, the sexual stories weren't just slander, they were a coping mechanism, a way for Roman men to deal with the cognitive dissonance of a woman who'd been running their empire and doing it well. And here's why I think this matters today. We're still doing this. We're still reducing powerful women to their sexual choices or appearance instead of evaluating their competence. We're still more comfortable with stories about women's private lives than their public achievements. How many times have you seen a female politician's appearance analysed more than her policies? How many times have powerful women been asked about work-life balance, while their male counterparts are asked about their vision for the country? How many times have we seen women's scandals dominate headlines while their actual work gets ignored? Messalina's story is extreme, absolutely, but the pattern is familiar, and that familiarity should make us uncomfortable. Now, I want to be really clear about something. I'm not saying Messalina was innocent. I'm not defending her murders or her blackmail or her systematic destruction of anyone who threatened her power. If even half of what the non-sexual sources report is true, she did terrible things. She ordered executions. She drove people to suicide. She used coercion and fear to build her power base. But here's the thing about historical judgment. We can condemn someone's actions while also recognizing that the stories told about them might be propaganda. We can say, she did bad things, and the stories about her were exaggerated for political purposes. Both can be true simultaneously. Professor Catherine Edwards from Birkbeck, University of London, wrote in her 1993 book The Politics of Immorality in Ancient Rome that allegations of sexual misconduct in Roman politics were rarely about sex. They were about delegitimizing political opponents by attacking their moral character. This is what I find most frustrating about Messalina's legacy. We'll never know who she really was. The real woman, with her actual motivations, her genuine emotions, her true character, is buried under 2,000 years of propaganda, exaggeration, and political revisionism. Was she a protective mother who made terrible choices? A psychopath who enjoyed cruelty? A political genius who miscalculated at the end? A victim of circumstances who did what she had to in order to survive? Some combination of all of these? We don't know. We can't know, because everyone who wrote about her had an agenda. Tacitus was writing under the Flavians, who needed to make the Julio-Claudians look bad to justify their coup. Suetonius was writing scandalous biography as entertainment. Juvenal was writing misogynistic satire. Cassius Dio was writing a century and a half later, relying on sources we can't verify. None of them knew Messalina personally. None of them were trying to write objective history. They were all telling stories that served their own purposes, and that brings me to what I think is the real lesson here. Every historical narrative is constructed. Every story we hear about the past has been filtered through layers of bias, agenda, and cultural assumption. The victors don't just win the war, they win the story. And whoever controls the story controls what we believe about the past. This isn't unique to ancient Rome. Modern historians deal with this constantly. When we study any historical figure, we have to ask, who's telling this story? Why are they telling it this way? What do they gain from this narrative? What voices are missing? With Messalina, the voices that are missing are pretty obvious. Women's voices. Messalina herself never got to tell her side. No contemporary female historians recorded what was happening. We get the story entirely through the eyes of men, writing decades later, with specific political motives. What would Messalina's version of events have been? What would she have said in her defense? We'll never know because she was executed before she could speak, and then systematically erased from memory. But I think there's something powerful in acknowledging that gap. In saying we don't know the whole story, and we should be suspicious of the story we do have. That intellectual humility, that willingness to question received narratives, is more important than ever in an age of misinformation and competing historical revisionism. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this. What other historical figures have we completely misunderstood because we only heard one side of the story? How many people have been simplified into heroes or villains when the reality was far more complex? History isn't a collection of facts. It's a collection of stories about facts, and those stories are told by people with biases and agendas and limited information. Understanding that doesn't mean we abandon the pursuit of historical truth. It means we pursue it more carefully, more critically, with awareness that every source has a perspective. There's also something deeply human about Messalina's story that transcends the historical debate. Strip away the propaganda and the politics and the scandal, and you're left with a woman who loved her children, who wanted power, who felt desire, who made terrible choices, who was terrified in her final moments. Those are universal human experiences: love, ambition, fear, failure. The specifics are unique to ancient Rome, but the emotions are timeless. And maybe that's why her story has survived despite Rome's best efforts to erase it, because underneath all the scandal and exaggeration, there's something fundamentally human that we recognize. A woman trying to protect her children in a dangerous world, a person corrupted by power, someone who had everything and lost it all through one catastrophic mistake. We can relate to that, even across 2 millennia. We can see ourselves in her failures, her fears, her final desperate reach toward her children. That's the power of story. That's why history matters. Now, I want to end with something that I think puts Messalina's entire story in perspective. In 1982, archaeologists discovered something remarkable during excavations near the Quirinal Hill in Rome. It was a small lead curse tablet, the ancient equivalent of a hex or spell, dated to around 50 CE, just 2 years after Messalina's death. The tablet, published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology in 1984, contains a curse against an unnamed woman who destroyed my family. The writer asks the gods to punish this woman in the afterlife, to make her suffer as she made others suffer, and then, tellingly, the curse adds, "Though her name is forgotten, the gods know who she is." The archaeologists who found it believe it might have been written by someone affected by Messalina's purges, a widow whose husband was executed, a mother whose son was killed, someone who'd lost everything because of the Empress's political games. And what strikes me about this curse is its acknowledgement that Messalina's name was already being erased, though her name is forgotten. But the writer believed that somewhere, somehow, justice would be served, that even if history forgot her, the universe wouldn't. I don't know if that gives me hope or sadness. Hope, maybe, that even when powerful people try to erase the truth, it survives somehow. Sadness that so much pain was caused and so little justice was achieved. Because ultimately, what happened to Messalina? Her enemies won. They erased her name, killed her children, rewrote history to make her into a monster and got away with it. Narcissus, the freedman who orchestrated her death, served Claudius for another 6 years. Agrippina became empress and put her son on the throne. The senators who attended that scandalous wedding and did nothing to stop it. Most of them survived just fine. The only people who really suffered were Messalina herself and her children. The innocent and the guilty both destroyed by a system that chewed people up and spit them out. And that, maybe, is the most important lesson of all. Not that Messalina was good or bad, innocent or guilty, victim or villain, but that the Roman imperial system was so fundamentally broken that it destroyed everyone who touched it. Good people, bad people, children, adults. It didn't matter. The machine kept running, grinding up lives and spitting out stories. Messalina's tragedy isn't just her personal story. It's the tragedy of a system where power required ruthlessness, where survival required murder, where protecting your children meant destroying other people's children, and where the only way to have influence as a woman was through manipulation and sex. She didn't create that system. She was born into it, and she played the game as well as anyone could, using the only tools available to her. The fact that she eventually lost doesn't make her unique. It makes her typical. Because in Rome's imperial game, almost everyone eventually lost. So where does that leave us, 2,000 years later, still talking about her? I think it leaves us with questions, which is exactly where we should be. Questions about power and gender. Questions about how we judge historical figures. Questions about propaganda and truth. Questions about the stories we tell and the stories we believe. Messalina's story doesn't have a neat moral or a clear lesson. Real history rarely does. But it has value in its complexity, in its refusal to be simple, in the way it challenges us to think critically about narratives we've accepted without question. And maybe, just maybe, it can make us think twice before we reduce any powerful woman, historical or contemporary, to sexual scandal and character assassination. Maybe it can make us ask, what's the real story here? Who benefits from this narrative? What voices are we not hearing? If Messalina's catastrophic rise and fall can teach us to be more skeptical of historical propaganda, more aware of how gender bias shapes narratives, and more careful about how we judge complex figures from the past, then maybe her story wasn't in vain. She wanted to be remembered as the mother of an emperor, as the powerful Augusta who shaped Rome's destiny. Instead, she became a cautionary tale about female sexuality and the dangers of women in power. But we can choose to remember her differently. Not as a saint, she wasn't. Not as a simple villain, she wasn't that either. But as a complicated, flawed, ambitious, terrified, ruthless, protective, calculating human person who lived in impossible circumstances and made both brilliant and catastrophic choices. We can remember that her story was written by her enemies. We can acknowledge what we know, admit what we don't, and refuse to accept the simplified propaganda version of her life. And most importantly, we can ask ourselves, what other stories are we getting wrong? What other historical figures have been simplified, demonized, or erased because it serves someone's political interests? How many Messalinas are buried in our history books, waiting for us to dig deeper and ask better questions? Because the lesson of Messalina isn't really about ancient Rome at all. It's about now. It's about how we think about power, how we judge women, how we consume history, and how easily we accept narratives that confirm our biases. So the next time you hear a scandalous story about a powerful woman, whether from 2,000 years ago or from yesterday's headlines, I hope you'll pause and ask, is this the whole story? Who's telling it? What aren't they telling me? That skepticism, that critical thinking, that refusal to accept simple narratives about complex people, that might be Messalina's real legacy. Not the scandal she supposedly created, but the skepticism her story should create in us. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most controversial lives. If this story made you think, made you question, or made you see history differently, then we've done something valuable together. What do you think? Was Messalina a victim of her circumstances or the architect of her own destruction? A protective mother or a ruthless killer? A political genius or a cautionary tale? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient Rome's darkest corners, hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories to tell, more myths to examine, more historical figures who deserve a second look beyond the propaganda. Until next time, sleep well, think critically, and remember, history is never as simple as the stories make it seem. Good night.